Warriors, hail. Welcome to our hall. Before we begin, I call upon all true followers of Odin to join our ranks, so make sure to subscribe to the channel to support our legion. As you can see, our channel is new, and every warrior is crucial to our journey. Subscribe to strengthen our horde and make our battle cry echo across all lands. Also, tell us in the comments where you're from. Do we have battle brothers from the northern or southern lands? I want to get to know our brotherhood. Raise your mugs and toast with us by clicking the like button. Do all of this because together, we will conquer not just lands, but Valhalla itself. All because the quill scratched softly against the parchment as I, Brother Ethelred, recorded the day's events in the monastery's annals. The scriptorium was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of robes and the gentle scratching of other monks at work. Outside, a cool breeze carried the scent of the sea through the narrow windows, a familiar comfort that had always brought me peace. But today, the breeze carried something else, whispers of unrest that had been growing louder with each passing day. "Brother Ethelred," a voice called, breaking my concentration. I looked up to see Brother Oswald, his round face creased with worry. "Have you heard the latest news from the coast?" I set down my quill and turned to face him fully. "I've heard only murmurs, brother. What troubles you?" Oswald glanced around, ensuring we wouldn't be overheard. "Fishermen speak of strange ships on the horizon, ships with dragon heads and square sails, unlike any they've seen before." A chill ran down my spine. We'd all heard tales of the Northmen and their fearsome longships, but they had always seemed like distant threats, more legend than reality. "Are we certain it's them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The Northmen?" Oswald nodded gravely. The descriptions matched the stories all too well. "Brother Ethelred, I fear dark times are coming to our shores." I closed my eyes, offering a silent prayer for protection. When I opened them, I saw the fear reflected in Oswald's gaze. "We must have faith, brother. God will protect his flock." But even as I spoke the words, doubt gnawed at my heart. The rest of the day passed in a haze of uncertainty. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting to the image of dragon-prowed ships cutting through the waves, bearing down on our peaceful coast. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the monastery grounds, a commotion erupted near the main gate. I rushed out of the scriptorium, my heart pounding in my chest. A crowd had gathered around a man I didn't recognize. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face streaked with soot and what looked horribly like blood. He was gasping for breath, his eyes wild with terror. "They've come!" he cried out. "The demons from the sea! They've ransacked Lindisfarne!" A collective gasp rose from the assembled monks. Lindisfarne, our sister monastery to the north, was known throughout the land for its holiness and its treasure of sacred relics. Abbot Edwulf pushed through the crowd, his normally serene face etched with concern. "Calm yourself, good man. Tell us what you've seen." The messenger took a deep breath, his whole body trembling. It was dawn when they came. Their ships, so many ships, they fell upon us like wolves on a flock of sheep. They showed no mercy, no fear of God or man. He went on to describe scenes of brutality that made my blood run cold, sacred objects desecrated, monks cut down where they stood, buildings put to the torch. I found myself struggling to reconcile the savagery of the attack with my understanding of God's plan for his people. "Why?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "Why would God allow this?" An older monk named Brother Cuthbert overheard me. He placed a gnarled hand on my shoulder, his eyes filled with a wisdom born of years of devotion. "The ways of the Lord are mysterious, Brother Ethelred. It is not for us to question, but to have faith and to record what transpires, so that future generations may learn from these dark days." His words reminded me of my duty as a chronicler. I nodded, squaring my shoulders. "You're right, Brother Cuthbert. I shall redouble my efforts to document these events, no matter how painful they may be." As night fell, the monastery was a flurry of activity. Abbot Edwulf called an emergency meeting of all the brothers. "My sons, He addressed us, his voice firm despite the gravity of the situation. The evil we have long feared has come to our shores. We must act swiftly to protect not only ourselves, but the sacred knowledge and relics entrusted to our care. He turned to me and several other brothers. Ethelred, you and your fellow scribes must secure our most precious manuscripts. Copy what you can, hide what you must. We cannot allow the wisdom of ages to be lost to these barbarians. I nodded solemnly, already mentally cataloging the most important texts in our library. To others he gave different tasks, securing foodstuffs, preparing defenses, organizing prayer vigils. As the meeting dispersed, a sense of purpose seemed to overtake the earlier panic. I made my way to the library, determined to begin my work immediately. As I walked, I overheard snatches of conversation that painted a grim picture of our situation. Will the king send aid? Can our walls withstand their siege engines? Should we abandon the monastery and flee inland? Each question added to the weight on my shoulders. I realized that the chronicles I would write in the coming days might be the only testament left of our way of life. In the library, I met with brothers Oswald and Dunstan. We worked in silence for a time, carefully selecting the most valuable manuscripts and preparing them for hiding or hasty transcription. Dunstan broke the silence, his young face pale in the candlelight. Brother Ethelred, do you think we'll survive this? I paused, choosing my words carefully. I don't know, Dunstan, but I do know that our work here is vital. Whether we live or die, the words we preserve may shape the future of our people. Oswald nodded in agreement. Ethelred speaks wisely. We must have faith and do our duty, come what may. We worked through the night, our quills scratching frantically as we copied text after text. My hand cramped, my eyes burned, but I pushed on, driven by a sense of urgency I had never known before. As dawn approached, I stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, but instead of the usual colors of sunrise, a deep, blood-red moon hung low on the horizon. I shuddered, remembering the words of Scripture. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Lord, I whispered, my voice trembling, if this is to be our final hour, grant us the strength to face it with courage and faith. I stood there for a long moment, watching the red moon slowly sink below the horizon. As it disappeared, I felt a strange mix of dread and determination settle over me. Whatever trials lay ahead, I would face them with pen in hand, recording the truth for those who might come after. With a deep breath, I turned and went back inside. There was still much work to be done and precious little time to do it. The chronicles of our people's darkest hour were yet to be written, and I, Brother Ethelred, would be the one to write them. As I settled back at my desk, quill poised over parchment, I said a silent prayer. Guide my hand, Lord. Let the words I write be a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope for future generations. And if it be your will, grant us the strength to endure the storm that is surely coming. The parchment crinkled beneath my fingers as I rolled up the latest chronicle, my hand trembling slightly. It had been weeks since the first attacks, and the news grew grimmer with each passing day. I, Brother Ethelred, once a simple monk and scribe, now found myself the reluctant chronicler of my people's darkest hour. Brother Ethelred, called a voice from the doorway. I turned to see Brother Oswald, his face ashen. The abbot requires your presence immediately. I nodded, swallowing hard as I followed him through the winding corridors of the monastery. The air was thick with tension, and even the stone walls seemed to whisper of impending doom. In the abbot's chamber, a group of monks had already gathered. Abbot Edwulf's face was grave as he addressed us. My brothers, he began, his voice low and urgent. Word has reached us that the Northmen have established a foothold on our shores. They've set up a permanent camp near the mouth of the Humber. A collective gasp rippled through the room. I felt my heart sink. This was no longer just a series of raids. It was an invasion. "What are we to do, Father Abbot?" asked Brother Dunstan, his young face pale with fear. Abbot Eadwulf sighed heavily. "We must warn the nearby villages. Many still do not know the extent of the danger." His eyes fell on me. "Brother Ethelred, you will join a group of monks on this mission. Your skills as a scribe may be needed to record what you find." I nodded, though fear clutched at my heart. "Yes, Father Abbot, I will do as you ask." As we prepared for our journey, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The future of our kingdom, once so certain, now seemed to hang by a thread. We set out at dawn, a group of 5 monks on sturdy ponies. The countryside, usually so peaceful, now seemed fraught with hidden dangers. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant shout, made us start with fear. Brother Cuthbert, the eldest among us, tried to lighten the mood. "Come now, brothers," he said with a forced chuckle. "Surely our Lord wouldn't let a few heathens overturn his grand plan for us." But his words rang hollow, and we rode on in somber silence. As we approached the first village on our route, an acrid smell filled the air. Smoke. My heart began to race. "Dear God, no," whispered Brother Oswald beside me. We crested a hill, and the sight before us stole the breath from my lungs. The village, once a thriving community of nearly 100 souls, was now nothing more than smoldering ruins. Blackened timbers jutted from the ground like broken teeth, and the air was thick with ash and the sickly sweet smell of death. "We're too late," I murmured, dismounting from my pony. "Far too late." We moved through the ruins in stunned silence, searching for any sign of survivors. But everywhere we looked, we found only devastation. Then, a sound caught my ear. A faint whimper, barely audible over the crackle of dying fires. I turned, straining to locate its source. "Over here," I called to the others, rushing towards a collapsed barn. "I hear something." Together, we cleared away the debris, and there, huddled in a small pocket of space, we found a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his face streaked with soot and tears. "It's all right, child," I said softly, reaching out to him. "We're here to help. You're safe now." The boy looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. Are you angels?" he asked in a trembling voice. Despite the grim situation, I couldn't help but smile. "No, my child. We're monks from the monastery to the south. Can you tell us your name?" "Edwig," he whispered. "My name is Edwig." As we tended to the boy's minor injuries, I knelt beside him. "Edwig," I said gently, "I know it's difficult, but can you tell us what happened here?" The boy's lower lip trembled, but he nodded bravely. "They came at dawn," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Men in strange armor, with axes and swords. They killed everyone. My father told me to hide in the barn, and I heard." He broke off, unable to continue. I placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're very brave, Edwig. Your story is important, and I promise you it will be remembered." In that moment, I made a silent vow to record every word of Edwig's tale, to ensure that the suffering of his village would not be forgotten. We couldn't linger long in the ruined village. With heavy hearts, we set Edwig on my pony and began the journey back to the monastery. As we rode, I couldn't shake the image of the devastated village from my mind. Was this to be the fate of all England? Our return to the monastery was met with chaos. The courtyard was filled with horses and carts, and unfamiliar faces peered out from every window. "What's happening?" I asked Brother Oswald as we dismounted. He shook his head, looking bewildered. "It seems word of the invasion has spread. Nobles from the surrounding areas are seeking sanctuary within our walls." We made our way through the crowd, Edwig clinging tightly to my hand. The air was thick with tension and fear, and everywhere I looked, I saw faces etched with worry. As we approached the main hall, raised voices caught my attention. I recognized the deep tones of Abbot Eadwulf, along with several others I didn't know. "We must fight," came a booming voice. These heathens understand nothing but the language of steel. And lead more of our people to slaughter? Countered another voice. Perhaps if we offer them tribute, they will be satisfied and leave us in peace. I exchanged a glance with Brother Oswald. These were weighty matters being discussed, far beyond the usual concerns of our quiet monastic life. Stay with the boy, I whispered to Oswald. I need to hear this. Carefully, I edged closer to the partially open door of the hall, straining to hear the debate within. My lords, came the measured tones of Abbot Edwulf, I understand your fears, but we must not let panic drive our decisions. We need a united front if we are to weather this storm. United? Scoffed a voice I recognized as belonging to Ealdorman Ethelred of Mercia. How can we unite when half of us wish to kneel before these barbarians, while the other half would throw away lives in a futile resistance? The argument continued, voices rising and falling like the tide. I stood there, my mind reeling from what I was hearing. Our leaders, the men we looked to for guidance and protection, were divided. Some advocated for immediate military action, others for appeasement, and still others for simply fleeing further inland. As I listened, a chill ran down my spine. If our leaders couldn't agree on a course of action, what hope did we have of surviving this invasion? Suddenly, a hand fell on my shoulder, making me jump. I turned to see Brother Cuthbert, his eyes knowing. "Eavesdropping, Brother Ethelred?" he asked, though there was no reproach in his voice. I nodded, too shaken to deny it. "Brother Cuthbert, what are we to do? If our leaders are so divided..." He sighed heavily. "We do what we have always done, my son. We pray, we work, and we record. We work. The future may be uncertain, but our duty remains clear." As we walked away from the hall, leaving the arguing nobles behind, I thought of young Eadwig, of the ruined village, of the red moon that had seemed to herald this calamity. The storm had indeed broken upon our shores, and I feared it would reshape the very fabric of our world. That night, as I sat down to record the day's events in the chronicle, my quill hovered over the parchment. How could I possibly capture the magnitude of what was happening? The fear, the uncertainty, the division among our leaders? Finally, I began to write. In this year of our Lord 793, a great calamity has befallen the kingdom of Northumbria, and indeed, all of England. The Northmen, those fierce warriors from across the sea, have established a foothold on our shores. Villages burn, innocents perish, and our leaders argue while the enemy grows stronger. I, Brother Ethelred, chronicle these dark days with a heavy heart, praying that future generations might learn from our trials and tribulations. May God grant us the wisdom and strength to face the storms that surely lie ahead. As I finished writing, I looked up to see the first light of dawn creeping through the window. Another day was beginning, bringing with it new challenges and fears. But as I closed the chronicle and prepared for morning prayers, I felt a small spark of determination ignite within me. Whatever came, I would be here to record it, to ensure that our story, for better or worse, would not be lost to the mists of time. The monastery bells tolled, their solemn peals echoing across the grounds. I, Brother Ethelred, looked up from my writing, quill poised mid-sentence. The sound was not for prayer or mealtimes. It heralded the arrival of an important visitor. Brother Ethelred, young Edwig, the boy we had rescued, came running into the scriptorium, his eyes wide with excitement. "The king is here, King Ethelbald himself." I set down my quill, my heart quickening. "Are you certain, Edwig?" He nodded vigorously. I saw his banner, the Golden Dragon of Wessex. Rising from my desk, I hurried to the window. Indeed, a procession was entering the monastery gates, led by a man astride a magnificent white stallion. The Golden Dragon banner fluttered in the breeze behind him. "It seems dark times bring even kings to our humble monastery," I murmured. As I made my way to the courtyard, joining the gathering crowd of monks and nobles, I couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and trepidation. King Ethelbald of Wessex was known as a strong ruler, But the Viking threat had shaken the foundations of all our kingdoms. The king dismounted, his face grave as he surveyed the assembled crowd. Abbot Edwulf stepped forward, bowing deeply. "Your Majesty," he said, "we are honored by your presence. How may we serve you?" King Ethelbald's voice was tired but resolute as he replied, "Good Abbot, I come seeking the wisdom of your order and the guidance of the Almighty. The Northmen grow bolder with each passing day, and I fear for the future of our realm." A murmur rippled through the crowd. To hear such words from our king, it made the danger seem all the more real. The king was escorted inside, and I returned to my duties, my mind whirling with the implications of this royal visit. As night fell, I was summoned to the abbot's chambers. "Brother Ethelred," Abbot Edwulf said as I entered, "the king has requested our wisest minds to advise him. Your knowledge of our history and your skill with words have not gone unnoticed. You will join us in council." Stunned, I could only nod. I am honored, Father Abbot." The council lasted long into the night. Maps were pored over, reports of Viking movements discussed, and strategies debated. As dawn broke, a decision was reached. "We must negotiate," King Ethelbald declared, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "Perhaps we can reach an accord with these Northmen, buy time to strengthen our defenses." He turned to the abbot. "I require a scribe to accompany the delegation, someone who can accurately record the proceedings." Abbot Edwulf's eyes fell on me. "Brother Ethelred is our finest chronicler, Your Majesty. He will serve you well." And so, with a mixture of fear and curiosity churning in my stomach, I found myself part of a delegation bound for the Viking encampment. As our small party rode out, I caught sight of Edwig watching from a window, his young face pinched with worry. I offered him what I hoped was a reassuring smile, even as doubt gnawed at my own heart. The journey to the Viking camp was tense, every rustle in the undergrowth setting us on edge. As we approached, the sight of their longships pulled up on the shore sent a chill down my spine. Their camp was a bustle of activity, with fierce-looking warriors sharpening weapons and repairing armor. We were led to a large tent at the center of the camp. Inside, seated on a makeshift throne of shields, was the Viking leader, a giant of a man with a beard like fire and eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "I am Bjorn Ironside," he growled in heavily accented Saxon. "You come to bargain for your lives?" Lord Ethelwulf, the head of our delegation, stepped forward. "We come to negotiate a peaceful resolution on behalf of King Ethelbald of Wessex." As the negotiations began, I furiously scribbled notes, trying to capture every word, every nuance of the tense exchange. Demands were made on both sides: land, gold, hostages. The air in the tent grew thick with tension. But then, something caught my ear that made my blood run cold. A Saxon voice speaking in fluent Norse. I glanced up, shocked to see Lord Wigmund, one of our own nobles, engaged in hushed conversation with a Viking advisor. "The western shores are poorly defended," I heard him say in Norse. "Strike there, and you'll meet little resistance." My quill faltered, ink blotting the parchment. Treason. Here, in the very heart of our delegation. The negotiations dragged on, but my mind was reeling from what I had overheard. As we prepared to leave, I noticed furtive glances exchanged between Lord Wigmund and several Vikings. My heart pounded in my chest. I had to get this information back to the king. Our return journey began in tense silence, but as we entered a densely wooded area, war cries suddenly split the air. Vikings burst from the trees, weapons glinting in the fading light. "Ambush!" Lord Ethelwulf cried, drawing his sword. Chaos erupted. I was thrown from my horse, my precious notes scattering in the wind. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw Lord Wigmund hanging back, making no move to defend his fellow Saxons. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I ran, ducking under branches and leaping over fallen logs. Behind me, I could hear the clash of steel and the screams of the dying. I don't know how long I ran, my lungs burning, branches whipping at my face. Finally, I collapsed behind a large oak, gasping for breath, as the sounds of battle faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The full weight of what had transpired hit me. I had survived, but at what cost? Lord Ethelwulf and the others, and were they dead? And the information I carried, the knowledge of Lord Wigmund's betrayal, it could shake the very foundations of our kingdom. As night fell, I began the long, lonely journey back to the monastery. With each step, the same question pounded in my mind. What should I do with this knowledge? If I revealed Lord Wigmund's treachery, it could tear our already fragile kingdom apart. Trust would crumble, alliances would shatter. But if I kept silent, how many more would die due to his betrayal? It was near dawn when I finally stumbled through the monastery gates, dirty, bloodied, and exhausted. Edwig was the first to spot me. "Brother Ethelred," he cried, running to me. "You're alive, but the others—" I shook my head, unable to speak. Abbot Edwulf appeared, his face grave. "Brother Ethelred, what happened? Where are the others?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I begin to explain? "Father Abbot," I finally managed, my voice hoarse, "I must speak with the king, immediately." The abbot's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, leading me to the guest quarters where King Ethelbald was staying. As I was ushered into the king's presence, I felt the weight of my knowledge like a physical burden. The king looked up, his eyes widening at my bedraggled state. "Brother Ethelred, what has happened?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This moment I realized could change the course of our kingdom's history. "Your Majesty," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "I bring grave news. Our delegation was ambushed on the return journey. I fear I may be the only survivor." The king's face darkened. "Treachery," he growled. "The Northmen cannot be trusted." I swallowed hard. "Sire, there is more. Something I witnessed during the negotiations. Something that concerns the loyalty of one of your nobles." As the king leaned forward, his eyes intent on my face, I felt the full weight of my decision. The words I was about to speak could not be unspoken. They would set in motion events that could save our kingdom, or tear it apart. "Speak, Brother Ethelred," the king urged. "What did you see?" I took a deep breath, silently praying for guidance. Then I began to tell my tale, my words spilling out like water from a broken dam. As I spoke of Lord Wigmund's betrayal, of the ambush, of my harrowing escape, I watched the king's face change, from shock to anger to a deep, sorrowful understanding. When I finished, silence fell over the room. The king stood, walking to the window to gaze out at the monastery grounds, now bathed in the light of dawn. "A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand," he murmured almost to himself. Then he turned back to me, his eyes blazing with a new determination. "Brother Ethelred, you have done a great service to your king and country this day. The road ahead will be difficult, but with God's grace and the truth you have brought to light, we shall weather this storm." As I left the king's presence, my heart was heavy but my conscience clear. I had chosen truth, no matter the cost. Now it was up to King Ethelbald to forge a path forward for our divided kingdom. Returning to my small cell, I sat down at my writing desk. There was much to record, much to ponder. As I dipped my quill in ink, I realized that my role as a chronicler had changed. I was no longer just an observer of history. I had become a part of it. With a steady hand, I began to write. In this year of our Lord 793, the kingdom of Wessex stands at a crossroads. Beset by enemies without and traitors within, we face our darkest hour. Yet in darkness, truth shines all the brighter. The rough-spun robe chafed against my skin as I trudged along the muddy path. Gone was the familiar comfort of my monk's habit, replaced by the coarse garments of a wandering holy man. I, Brother Ethelred, once a simple scribe, now found myself playing the role of spy in the very heart of our enemy's territory. King Ethelred's words echoed in my mind. Brother Ethelred, your keen eye and quick wit make you ideal for this task. Infiltrate the Viking settlement. Learn what you can of their plans, their strengths, their weaknesses. The fate of our kingdom may rest on what you discover. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on me with each step. As I approached the Viking settlement, my heart pounded so loudly I feared it might give me away. The settlement was a bustling hive of activity. Long ships lined the shore, their dragon prows seeming to sneer at me. Warriors sharpened weapons, women tended fires, and children ran about, their laughter a stark contrast to the grim purpose of this place. "You there, monk!" a gruff voice called out. I turned to see a burly Viking warrior eyeing me suspiciously. "What business have you here?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I am but a humble servant of God, seeking alms and offering blessings to all who would receive them," I replied, hoping my voice didn't betray my fear. The Viking grunted, looking me up and down. "We have no need for your Christian God here. But," he added with a smirk, "perhaps you can earn your keep. We could use someone to clean the pigsties." And so began my life among the Vikings. Days blurred together as I mucked out sties, carried water, and performed any menial task they set before me. All the while I kept my ears open, straining to catch any useful information. It was on my 5th day in the settlement that fate smiled upon me. As I was hauling a bucket of water from the well, I bumped into a man carrying a strange, harp-like instrument. "Watch where you're going, monk," he growled, but there was no real anger in his voice. "Forgive me," I said, bowing my head. "I couldn't help but notice your instrument. Are you a musician?" The man's face lit up. I am Bjorn Skaldson, a skald of some renown among my people, though I doubt a Christian monk would appreciate the sagas of the Norsemen." I saw an opportunity and seized it. "On the contrary, I find all forms of storytelling fascinating. Perhaps you might share a tale with me?" Bjorn looked surprised, then pleased. "Well now, it's not often I find an appreciative audience in these parts. Come, monk, sit with me, and I'll spin you a yarn that'll make your Christian saints seem dull as dishwater." And so began an unlikely friendship. Over the next few days, I spent what time I could with Bjorn, listening to his sagas and songs. Through his tales, I began to see the Vikings not just as brutal invaders, but as a people with their own rich culture and beliefs. "You see, monk," Bjorn said one evening as we sat by a fire, "our gods are not distant figures to be worshipped from afar. They feast with us, fight alongside us, love and quarrel, just as we do." I found myself fascinated, questioning the beliefs I had held my entire life. "But surely," I ventured, "there must be one supreme God, a creator of all things." Bjorn laughed heartily. "Why limit the divine to just one form? The world is vast and varied. Why shouldn't the gods be the same?" The dawn broke cold and gray over the eastern horizon. I stood atop the monastery's highest tower, my eyes straining against the dim light. For days we had been hearing rumors of a massive Viking force gathering across the sea. Now, as the mist began to clear, my worst fears were realized. They came like a plague of locusts upon the water. Hundreds of longships, their dragon prows cutting through the waves, their sails full with the wind that would bring destruction to our shores. The great heathen army had arrived. "Dear God," I whispered, my hands gripping the stone parapet so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Save us all." I barely remembered descending the tower stairs, my feet carrying me automatically to the king's chambers. King Ethelred was already awake, surrounded by his advisors, their faces grim in the flickering torchlight. "Your Majesty," I gasped, out of breath from my run. "They're here. The Viking fleet. It's like nothing I've ever seen." The king's face hardened, lines of worry etching deeper into his brow. "So, the storm is upon us at last." He turned to his generals, issuing rapid-fire orders for our defenses to be mustered. Then, unexpectedly, he turned back to me. Brother Ethelred, I have a task for you, one that may determine the fate of our kingdom. He held out a small scroll sealed with the royal signet. This message must reach our allies in Mercia. With their support, we might yet turn the tide against this heathen horde. I took the scroll with trembling hands, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on my shoulders. I will not fail you, Your Majesty. The king's eyes softened for a moment. I know you won't, my friend. May God speed your journey and keep you safe. Within the hour, I was on horseback, the precious scroll tucked safely inside my robes. As I rode out of the monastery gates, I could hear the clamor of preparations behind me, the shouts of soldiers, the clang of weapons being distributed, the prayers of those left behind. My journey took me through a landscape transformed by war. Fields that should have been green with spring growth lay trampled and barren. Villages stood empty, their inhabitants fled or worse. The acrid smell of smoke hung in the air, a constant reminder of the devastation that had already been wrought. On the third day of my journey, I crested a hill to find a scene of battle spread out before me. Saxon and Viking forces clashed in a chaotic melee, the air filled with the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded and dying. I urged my horse onward, skirting the edge of the battlefield. My mission was too important to be delayed, no matter how my heart ached to help my countrymen. As night fell, I found shelter in the ruins of a burned-out church. As I huddled in a corner trying to find warmth in my cloak, I couldn't help but reflect on the cruel irony. This place of worship, once a sanctuary, now stood as a stark symbol of all we stood to lose. Dawn broke, and I continued my journey. The land grew more unfamiliar as I crossed into Mercia, but the signs of war remained constant. It was with a mixture of relief and trepidation that I finally approached the stronghold of our Mercian allies. But as I drew closer, my heart sank. The gates stood open, unguarded. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No sounds of life reached my ears. With growing dread, I dismounted and entered the eerily silent fortress. The sight that greeted me would haunt my dreams for years to come. Bodies lay where they had fallen, not in battle, but struck down by an unseen enemy. The stench of death and decay filled the air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "Is anyone alive?" A weak cough answered me. Following the sound, I found a single survivor, a young soldier barely clinging to life. "What happened here?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "Plague," he gasped, his eyes glazed with fever. "Struck. So fast. Couldn't stop it." My heart sank. The allies we had counted on for reinforcements were gone, wiped out not by Viking swords, but by an enemy we couldn't even see. With a heavy heart, I performed last rites for the dying soldier, and as many others as I could. Then, knowing every moment was precious, I began the long journey back to King Ethelred, bearing news that could spell doom for our kingdom. The return journey was even more perilous. Viking raiding parties roamed the countryside, forcing me to travel by night and hide during the day. My stores of food dwindled and exhaustion weighed heavily upon me. It was on the fourth day of my return journey that I encountered them. As I picked my way through a dense forest, I heard voices. Not the harsh Norse of Viking raiders, but the familiar tones of my own people. Cautiously, I approached. In a small clearing, I found a group of Saxon refugees, women, children, and a few elderly men. They huddled around a meager fire, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. An old woman spotted me first. "Look," she cried, "a monk! Surely God has sent you to us in our hour of need." I felt torn. My mission was of utmost importance. The fate of the kingdom could rest on the news I carried. But how could I abandon these people in their time of need? A young boy approached me, his eyes wide. "Please, sir," he said, his voice trembling. "We haven't eaten in days. Do you have any food?" I reached into my saddlebag, pulling out the last of my meager rations. It wasn't much, but the gratitude in their eyes as I shared it out was overwhelming. As night fell, I made my decision. I couldn't leave these people to fend for themselves. "I will guide you to safety," I told them. "There's a monastery not far from here. They will provide shelter and food." The journey was slow and arduous. The elderly struggled to keep pace, and we had to stop frequently to rest. Every moment of delay felt like a knife in my heart, knowing the crucial information I carried. On the second day of our journey, disaster struck. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the forest. Viking scouts. "Hide!" I hissed, ushering the group into a dense thicket. We held our breath as the Vikings passed by, so close we could hear their conversation. My hand clutched the scroll hidden in my robes, knowing that discovery would mean not just my death but the loss of our last hope. By some miracle, we remained undetected. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, I let out a shaky breath. "We must move quickly," I told the group. "They'll be back with more men." We pushed on, exhaustion and fear driving us forward. Finally, as the sun began to set on the third day, we saw it, the walls of the monastery rising above the treetops. "Thank the Lord," breathed the old woman, tears in her eyes. As we approached the gates, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. These people would be safe now, but my journey was far from over. I entrusted the refugees to the care of the monks, pausing only long enough to gulp down some water and secure a fresh horse. As I prepared to ride out, the young boy who had first approached me tugged at my robe. "Thank you," he said simply, his eyes shining with gratitude. I managed a smile, ruffling his hair. "Stay safe, little one, and pray for us all." With that, I was off, riding hard for the king's camp. The scroll seemed to burn against my chest, a constant reminder of the vital information I carried and the time I had lost. As I rode through the night, my mind raced. Had I done the right thing in helping the refugees? Or had I doomed our kingdom by delaying? The weight of that decision pressed down on me, heavier than any burden I had ever borne. The first light of dawn was breaking as I finally spotted the royal standards flying over the king's camp. I had made it, but as I looked out over the assembled army, pitifully small compared to the Viking horde I had seen, I couldn't help but wonder, had I arrived in time to make a difference? Or was I bearing news of allies lost too late to change the tide of this war? With a silent prayer, I urged my horse forward. The din of battle surrounded me, a cacophony of clashing steel, thundering hooves, and the cries of the wounded and dying. I, Brother Ethelred, once a humble monk and scribe, now found myself in the midst of the greatest conflict our land had ever seen. My quill, so long my constant companion, had been replaced by a sword that felt alien and heavy in my hand. As I ducked beneath the swing of a Viking axe, parrying clumsily with my borrowed blade, I couldn't help but marvel at the cruel twist of fate that had brought me here. The hillside of Ashdown, once a peaceful stretch of English countryside, had been transformed into a hellscape of mud, blood, and chaos. "Stand fast, brothers," came a cry from nearby. "For God and for England!" I turned to see a group of Saxon warriors forming a shield wall, their faces grim with determination. Without thinking, I rushed to join them, slotting into place just as a wave of Viking berserkers crashed against our line. The impact was tremendous. I felt my feet slide in the blood-slicked mud, but somehow managed to keep my footing. The man next to me wasn't so lucky. As he fell, a gap opened in our line. "Close the wall," I shouted, surprising myself with the authority in my voice. The warriors on either side pressed together, sealing the breach. For what felt like hours, we held that line, our shields a bulwark against the Norse fury. My arms ached, my lungs burned, but still we fought on. This was no longer about kings or kingdoms. It was about survival. As the battle raged around us, I caught glimpses of the larger conflict. To our left, King Ethelred led a charge against the Viking flank, his banner flying proudly in the wind. To our right, a group of Norse raiders had broken through, threatening to encircle us, and then I saw him. Striding through the carnage like a demon from the depths of hell itself, came a figure that could only be Ivar the Boneless, the feared leader of the great heathen army. Despite his legendary disability, he moved with a fluid grace that belied his nickname. His eyes, cold and calculating, surveyed the battlefield as a chess master might study a game board. With a series of hand gestures, Ivar directed his forces with uncanny precision. Viking units moved in perfect coordination, exploiting every weakness in our lines. I watched in horrified awe as he systematically dismantled our defenses. "God save us," muttered the warrior beside me. "How can we hope to defeat such a foe?" Before I could respond, a great clamor arose from the rear of our forces. Turning, I saw a figure on horseback, his armor gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was Alfred, the king's younger brother, barely more than a boy, but with the bearing of a born leader. "Men of England," Alfred's voice rang out, clear and strong above the din of battle. "Look around you. This is our land, our home. Will you let these heathen invaders take it from us?" A resounding "no" echoed across the hillside. "Then fight," Alfred cried, raising his sword high. "Fight for your homes, your families, your very way of life. Fight, knowing that God and right are on our side. Fight, and let this day be remembered for 1,000 years as the day England stood against the storm and did not break." A great cheer went up from our ranks. I felt a surge of energy course through my tired limbs. As one, we pressed forward, driving back the Viking line. For a moment, it seemed as though the tide had turned. Our reinvigorated forces pushed the Vikings back step by bloody step. I found myself in the thick of it, my sword rising and falling almost of its own accord. But then, just as victory seemed within our grasp, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On our left flank, where King Ethelred had been leading the charge, I saw a group of Saxon nobles suddenly turn their banners. With horrifying clarity, I realized what was happening: treachery in our very midst. "Betrayal!" I shouted, my voice hoarse with exhaustion and despair. "The left flank has turned." But my warning came too late. The sudden reversal threw our lines into chaos. Vikings poured through the gap, threatening to encircle our entire force. I saw Alfred desperately trying to rally our troops, but the damage was done. The battle that had seemed on the verge of victory now teetered on the brink of catastrophic defeat. As the sun began to set on the blood-soaked fields of Ashdown, I found myself retreating with what remained of our shattered army. The cries of the wounded and dying echoed in my ears, a grim counterpoint to the victorious shouts of the Vikings. In the aftermath of the battle, as we licked our wounds and counted our losses, I was summoned to King Ethelred's tent. The king looked haggard, his face etched with lines of grief and exhaustion. "Brother Ethelred," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have a task for you, one that only you, with your gift for words, can perform." I knelt before him, my own body aching from the day's exertions. "Anything, Your Majesty." "I need you to record the names of the fallen," the king said. "Every man who gave his life for England today deserves to be remembered. Can you do this for me?" I nodded, feeling the weight of this grim duty settle on my shoulders. "I will, sire. I swear it." For days afterward, I walked the battlefield, quill and parchment in hand once more. Each name I wrote was a life cut short, a family left to mourn. As I worked, I couldn't help but reflect on the cruel ironies of war. There was Elfric the smith, who had laid down his hammer to take up a sword, and young Edmund, barely old enough to grow a beard, who had dreamed of becoming a monk before duty called him to battle. Heroes and cowards, nobles and commoners, in death, they were all equal. As I wrote, I found myself adding more than just names. Brief stories, snippets of lives lived and dreams unfulfilled, flowed from my quill. It was as if, in recording these details, I could somehow keep a small part of each fallen warrior alive. On the third day of my grim task, I came across a body that made me pause. It was one of the traitors, a noble who had turned his coat in the heat of battle. For a long moment I stood there, quill hovering over parchment. Did he deserve to be remembered alongside the loyal men who had died for their country? Or should his name be struck from history, his treachery forgotten? In the end, I wrote his name, adding a small mark next to it to denote his betrayal. It was not my place to judge, I decided. History would do that. As the sun set on my final day of recording, I looked out over the field of Ashdown. The bodies had been cleared away, but the earth was still stained dark with blood. In time, grass would grow here again, covering the scars of battle. But the memory of what had happened here would live on through the words I had written. I returned to King Ethelred's tent, my completed work in hand. The king took the scrolls from me with reverence, his eyes glistening with unshed tears as he scanned the endless list of names. "You have done well, brother Ethelred," he said softly. "These men, their sacrifices will not be forgotten." I bowed my head, feeling the weight of all I had witnessed pressing down upon me. "What now, your majesty? The Vikings still hold much of our land, and our army is sorely depleted." The king was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then, with a deep sigh, he straightened his shoulders. "Now we rebuild. We learn from our mistakes and we prepare. This battle may be lost, but the war is far from over." As I left the king's tent, I saw young Alfred standing nearby, his face etched with determination. In that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps all was not lost. Perhaps from the ashes of defeat, a stronger England would rise. I returned to my tent, pulling out a fresh sheet of parchment. There was more to record, more history to be written. The Battle of Ashdown may have ended, but I knew in my heart that it was only the beginning of a greater struggle to come. With a steady hand, I dipped my quill in ink and began to write. In the year of our Lord 871, on the fields of Ashdown, the fate of England hung in the balance. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the parchments strewn before me. I, brother Ethelred, once a simple scribe, now found myself embroiled in a web of intrigue that threatened the very foundation of our kingdom. The betrayal at Ashdown had planted a seed of suspicion in my mind, one that had grown into a gnawing certainty. There was a traitor in our midst, perhaps more than one. With trembling hands, I gathered the documents I had painstakingly collected over the past weeks. Fragments of overheard conversations, discrepancies in supply ledgers, mysterious comings and goings from the royal court. Alone, each piece seemed insignificant, but together, they painted a troubling picture. A soft knock at my chamber door startled me from my reverie. "Enter," I called, hastily covering my work with a blank parchment. The door creaked open to reveal the weathered face of Father Dunstan, my old mentor from the monastery. "Ethelred, my boy," he said, his voice warm with affection. "You've become quite the recluse these past weeks. The king is beginning to wonder if you've taken monastic vows again." I forced a smile, guilt gnawing at me for suspecting even this kind old man. "Forgive me, Father. I've been preoccupied with my chronicles of the battle." Dunstan's eyes softened with understanding. "Ah, yes, a heavy task to be sure. But remember, Ethelred, even in the darkest times we must not lose faith. God's plan, though mysterious, is always at work." As he turned to leave, a scrap of parchment fell from his robes. I stooped to retrieve it, my eyes widening as I caught a glimpse of unfamiliar runes scrawled across its surface. "Father, wait," I called, but he had already disappeared down the corridor. My heart pounding, I unfolded the parchment. The message was brief, written in a crude mix of Norse and Latin. "Midnight. The old oak. Bring the plans." Cold dread settled in my stomach. Could it be that Father Dunstan, the man who had taught me everything I knew, was involved in this treachery? As the castle settled into the quiet of night, I donned a dark cloak and slipped out into the moonlit grounds. The old oak stood at the edge of the forest, its gnarled branches reaching towards the star-studded sky. I concealed myself behind a thick bush, my breath catching in my throat as I saw a cloaked figure approach the tree. It was Father Dunstan. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Then, from the shadows of the forest emerged 3 men, 2 dressed as Saxon nobles and 1 unmistakably Viking, his braided beard gleaming silver in the moonlight. "You're late," Dunstan hissed. "Do you have any idea the risk I take in meeting you here?" The Viking stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "Save your complaints, priest. Do you have what we asked for?" Dunstan produced a roll of parchment from his robes. "The king's battle plans for the spring campaign. With this, your forces will be able to anticipate every move." My blood ran cold. This was worse than I had imagined. Not just information being leaked, but our entire strategy laid bare to the enemy. As I shifted for a better view, a twig snapped beneath my foot. 4 heads whipped in my direction. "We're being watched," one of the Saxon nobles cried. In an instant, chaos erupted. I turned to flee, but strong hands grasped me from behind. I found myself thrown to the ground, the gleaming edge of a dagger pressed against my throat. Well, well. Father Dunstan's familiar voice had taken on a cruel edge. "If it isn't our curious little scribe, I had so hoped you wouldn't stick your nose where it doesn't belong, Ethelred." "Why?" I gasped, struggling against my captor. "How could you betray us like this?" Dunstan's face twisted into a sneer. "Betray? I'm saving us, you fool, can't you see? This war is unwinnable. The Norse are too strong, too numerous. By cooperating, we ensure our survival, our place in the new order." "You're wrong," I spat. "This isn't survival, it's cowardice, it's—" The dagger pressed harder, cutting off my words. "Enough talk," the Viking growled. "Kill him and be done with it." Time seemed to slow. I saw the flash of the blade, felt its cold kiss against my skin. In that moment, survival instinct took over. My hand closed around a rock on the ground beside me. With all my strength, I swung it upwards, connecting with my captor's temple with a sickening crunch. The man crumpled, his dagger clattering to the ground. I snatched it up, scrambling to my feet. "Stop him!" Dunstan shouted, but I was already running, my legs carrying me faster than I'd ever moved in my life. Shouts and the sound of pursuit followed me through the forest. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step. But fear and adrenaline propelled me onward. Finally, gasping for breath, I burst from the tree line into the castle courtyard. "Guards!" I shouted. "Traitors, in the forest!" As torches flared to life and armored men rushed past me, I sank to my knees, the enormity of what had just transpired crashing over me. Hours later, I stood before King Ethelred in his private chambers, my tale spilling out in a rushed, disjointed narrative. The king listened in grim silence, his face growing darker with each word. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You've done a great service to the kingdom, brother Ethelred," he said at last. "But I fear this conspiracy goes deeper than we yet know. We must root out every last traitor, no matter their rank or station." I nodded, a leaden weight settling in my chest. "What would you have me do, sire?" The king's eyes met mine, filled with a determination that sent a shiver down my spine. "Continue your investigation, trust no one, and Ethelred, do whatever is necessary to protect our realm." As I left the king's chambers, my mind reeled with the implications of his words. I, who had once devoted my life to peace and learning, was now charged with ferreting out traitors, perhaps even taking more lives to protect our secrets. In the quiet of my room, I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. "Oh Lord," I whispered, "forgive me for what I must do." The coming days would test not just my loyalty to the crown, but the very fabric of my soul. As I blew out my candle and settled into a fitful sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. The battle for England's future had only just begun, and its greatest threats came not from without, but from within. The acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air as I, brother Ethelred, once a humble scribe and now a reluctant warrior, trudged along the muddy road. Around me, a ragtag group of refugees stumbled forward, their faces gaunt with hunger and etched with fear. The great heathen army had pushed further inland, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Our destination, the last Saxon stronghold, a beacon of hope in a land ravaged by war. "How much further, brother?" a weary voice called out. I turned to see Sarah, a young mother clutching a babe to her breast, her eyes pleading for reassurance. I forced a smile, though my own legs ached with each step. "Not far now, Sarah. We should reach the fortress by nightfall if we keep this pace." As we crested a hill, I heard a commotion from the front of our group. Quickening my pace, I pushed through the crowd to find the source of the disturbance. There, lying in a ditch by the roadside, was a sight that made my blood run cold. A Viking warrior. The man was clearly wounded, his blonde beard matted with blood, his breathing labored. Around him, our fellow refugees muttered darkly. "Kill him and be done with it," growled old Cedric, brandishing his walking stick like a weapon. "It's no more than these heathens have done to our people." A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd. I looked at the wounded Viking, seeing not a fearsome enemy, but a fellow human being in pain. In that moment, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. "No," I said, my voice ringing out with more authority than I felt. "We will not stoop to their level. This man is wounded and defenseless. As Christians, it is our duty to show mercy." Ignoring the grumbles of dissent, I knelt beside the Viking. His eyes, blue as a summer sky, flickered open, filled with a mixture of pain and surprise. "What is your name?" I asked in halting Norse, thanking God for the language lessons I had received during my time in the Viking camp. "Bjorn," he rasped. "Bjorn Ironside." My eyes widened in recognition. This was no ordinary warrior, but one of the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. "Can you walk, Bjorn Ironside?" I asked. He nodded weakly. With the help of a reluctant Cedric, I managed to get Bjorn to his feet. As we rejoined the group, I could feel the weight of disapproving stares, but I pressed on, supporting the wounded Viking. As we traveled, Bjorn's strength gradually returned. To my surprise, he began to speak, his words carrying an otherworldly quality that sent shivers down my spine. "I have seen it," he murmured, his eyes distant. "The future of this land." Intrigued despite myself, I leaned closer. "What do you mean? What have you seen?" Bjorn's voice took on a rhythmic cadence, as if reciting an ancient poem. "A king will rise from the ashes of war, a leader both wise and strong. He will unite the Saxon people, drive back the tide of invasion, and forge a nation that will stand for 1,000 years." I felt a spark of hope ignite in my chest. "This king, do you know his name?" Bjorn shook his head. "Names are shadows in the mists of time, but I see him clearly, young with eyes that burn with determination. He will be tested, will know defeat and exile, but in the end, he will triumph." As Bjorn spoke, I couldn't help but think of young Alfred, the king's brother. Could he be the leader this Viking seer foresaw? Our journey continued, days blending into nights. Bjorn's prophecies became a source of both hope and contention among our group. Some listened eagerly, clinging to the promise of a brighter future. Others muttered darkly about pagan sorcery. On the 7th day of our journey, we crested a final hill to see a sight that made my heart soar, the mighty walls of the last Saxon stronghold. But my joy was short-lived. As we drew closer, the grim reality of the situation became clear. The fortress was under siege. A vast Viking army surrounded it, their camp stretching as far as the eye could see. Smoke rose from within the walls, and even from this distance, I could see figures moving frantically along the battlements. "Dear God," I whispered, "we're too late." Bjorn, now strong enough to walk unaided, stood beside me. His face was grim as he surveyed the scene. "My people are thorough," he said. "They will not leave until the fortress falls or winter forces them to retreat." I turned to him, desperation clawing at my heart. There must be something we can do, some way to break the siege. Bjorn was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. Perhaps there is a way, but it will require great courage and a deep understanding of Viking customs." As Bjorn outlined his plan, I felt a mixture of hope and terror. It was audacious, dangerous, and might very well get us all killed. But as I looked at the faces of the refugees behind me, men, women, and children who had already lost everything, I knew we had to try. "Very well," I said, squaring my shoulders. "Tell me everything I need to know about Viking customs. If we're to have any chance of success, I must play my part perfectly." As night fell, Bjorn and I put our plan into action. Dressed in Viking garb with my tonsure hidden beneath a helm, I approached the enemy camp. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. "Halt!" a gruff voice called out in Norse. "Who goes there?" I took a deep breath, praying my accent would pass muster. "I bring word from Bjorn Ironside," I called back. "He challenges Ivar the Boneless to Holmgang." A ripple of excitement passed through the Viking ranks. Holmgang, the ritual duel used to settle disputes, was sacred in their culture. To refuse such a challenge would bring great shame. I was escorted to the center of the camp, where Ivar the Boneless sat upon a makeshift throne. His penetrating gaze seemed to see right through my disguise. "So," he said, his voice cold as ice, "my brother challenges me. And where is Bjorn? Why does he send a messenger instead of facing me himself?" I swallowed hard, reciting the words Bjorn had taught me. "Bjorn Ironside lies wounded, but his honor demands this challenge be issued. He invokes the ancient right of champion. I stand ready to fight in his stead." Murmurs rippled through the assembled warriors. Ivar's eyes narrowed, but I saw a glimmer of respect in their depths. "Very well," he said at last. "At dawn tomorrow, we shall have our Holmgang. Prepare yourself, little Saxon. You'll need all the help your Christian God can give you." As I was led away to a tent to await the morning's duel, I sent up a silent prayer. Our plan hinged on this moment. While the Vikings were distracted by the Holmgang, Bjorn would lead our people to a secret entrance to the fortress, one known only to him from a previous raid. Dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I stood in the center of a ring of Vikings, my borrowed sword feeling heavy and awkward in my hand. Across from me, Ivar the Boneless advanced, moving with a fluid grace that belied his nickname. "Begin!" The shout rang out, and Ivar lunged forward. I parried desperately, my muscles screaming in protest. Ivar was a whirlwind of steel, each blow threatening to overwhelm me. But as we fought, I caught glimpses of movement beyond the ring of spectators, refugees slipping past, making their way towards the fortress. With a mighty blow, Ivar knocked the sword from my hand. I fell to my knees, awaiting the killing stroke. But it never came. Instead, a horn blasted from the fortress walls. "Treachery!" came a cry from the Viking ranks. "The fortress gates open! Saxon reinforcements pour forth!" Chaos erupted. In the confusion, I managed to slip away, sprinting towards the fortress. As I reached the gates, I saw Bjorn waiting for me, a grin on his face. "Well played, brother Ethelred," he said. "It seems your god favors the bold." As the gates closed behind us, sealing out the sounds of battle, I allowed myself a moment of pure relief. We had done it, broken the siege and saved hundreds of lives. But as I looked out over the sea of grateful faces, I knew our trials were far from over. The Vikings would regroup, would come again with even greater fury. And when they did, we would need more than just cunning and bravery to survive. We would need the great King Bjorn had foreseen, a leader to unite our people and drive back the tide of invasion. As my eyes fell on young Alfred, standing tall amidst the chaos, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, that king was already among us. The fortress walls loomed above me, a testament to Saxon perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet as I, brother Ethelred, gazed out over the sea of Viking tents stretching to the horizon, I felt my faith waver like a candle in a storm. The past weeks had been a crucible of suffering. Food ran scarce within the fortress, and the constant barrage of Viking attacks had taken its toll. The moans of the wounded echoed through the halls, a grim chorus that haunted my dreams. As I made my daily rounds, tending to the sick and offering what comfort I could, I found myself in the great hall. There, I witnessed a sight that shook me to my core. A group of Saxon warriors huddled around a makeshift altar, upon which lay a crudely carved wooden idol. As I watched, they began to chant, their words a mix of Old English and broken Norse. "What is the meaning of this?" I demanded, my voice sharp with shock and disapproval. One of the men, a grizzled veteran named Osric, turned to me with defiant eyes. "We invoke the old gods, brother. Your Christian God seems to have abandoned us, so we turn to Thor and Odin for protection." I felt as if I'd been struck. This is blasphemy. Have you forgotten all that the church has taught you?" Osric spat on the ground. "The church didn't save my family from Viking blades. Perhaps the gods of our ancestors will prove stronger." As I opened my mouth to protest further, a commotion from outside drew our attention. We rushed to the walls to see a group of Viking prisoners being led into the courtyard. To my horror, I recognized one of them, Bjorn Ironside, the man whose visions had given us hope, now bound and bloodied. King Ethelred stood before the prisoners, his face a mask of grim determination. "These heathens have plagued our lands for too long," he declared. "Today, we show them the power of the one true God." With a sickening lurch in my stomach, I realized what was about to happen. The king raised his sword, prepared to execute the prisoners in the name of our faith. In that moment, something broke within me. I rushed forward, my voice ringing out across the courtyard. "Stop! In the name of all that is holy, stop this madness!" All eyes turned to me as I placed myself between the king and the prisoners. "Your Majesty," I pleaded, "is this truly the will of God? To slaughter defenseless men?" The king's eyes blazed with anger. "You dare question me, Brother Ethelred? These are the enemies of Christ." "They are men," I countered, my voice shaking. "Men created in God's image, just as we are. Did not Christ himself teach us to love our enemies?" A murmur ran through the crowd. I saw uncertainty flicker in the king's eyes, but before he could respond, a voice called out from the gathered Saxons. "The monk speaks treason. He sympathizes with the heathens." Shouts of agreement rose up, and I felt the mood of the crowd turning dangerous. In that moment, facing the hatred and fear of my own people, I felt my faith crumble entirely. As night fell, I found myself alone in the chapel, my mind a whirlwind of doubt and despair. The crucifix on the altar seemed to mock me, a symbol of a God who had remained silent in the face of such suffering. "Why?" I whispered, falling to my knees. "Why have you abandoned us? Why do you allow such cruelty to persist?" No answer came, only the hollow echo of my own voice bouncing off cold stone walls. In that moment of utter desolation, a treacherous thought crept into my mind. Perhaps Osric and the others were right. Perhaps the old gods, the gods of the Vikings, were stronger. They at least seemed to reward their followers with victory and plunder. I rose, my decision made. I would renounce my vows, cast aside this faith that had failed us. I would join the Vikings, embrace their ways, and perhaps find some measure of peace in the chaos of this world. As I turned to leave the chapel, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. And then, in the depths of that darkness, I saw something. A point of light, no larger than a candle flame, appeared before me. As I watched, transfixed, it grew, expanding into a shimmering veil of radiance. And within that light, I saw visions. I saw a great king, wise and just, uniting the Saxon people. I saw monasteries rising from the ashes of war, centers of learning and faith that would preserve knowledge through the darkest of times. I saw a nation born from the crucible of this conflict, a nation that would carry the light of Christ to the farthest corners of the world. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the vision faded. I found myself once more in the dark chapel, but the darkness no longer seemed so absolute. A ray of moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the crucifix on the altar. In that moment I understood. Faith was not about receiving answers to every question, or being spared from every hardship. It was about finding the strength to persevere, to hold on to hope even in the darkest of times. With renewed purpose, I strode from the chapel. Dawn was breaking as I made my way to the great hall where the defenders of the fortress had gathered. Their faces were haggard, their spirits low, but as I stood before them, I felt a fire burning within me. "Brothers and sisters," I began, my voice ringing out clear and strong. "I stand before you not just as a man of God, but as a Saxon, born of this land that we now fight to defend." I saw heads lift, eyes focusing on me with a mixture of curiosity and desperate hope. We face dark times, it is true. The enemy at our gates is fierce and numerous. But I tell you this, we are not alone in this fight. I raised my arms, my voice swelling with passion. The God of our fathers stands with us. The same God who gave David strength against Goliath, who delivered the Israelites from bondage in Egypt, now lends his might to our cause. A murmur ran through the crowd, a spark of hope kindling in their eyes. "But hear me well," I continued, "for God helps those who help themselves. We must be as cunning as serpents, as brave as lions. Let us remember the tales of our ancestors, the great heroes who defended this land before us." I recounted the story of Beowulf, his courage in the face of the monster Grendel. I spoke of Alfred the Great, whose wisdom and strength had once before saved our people from Viking invaders. And now, my brothers and sisters, it falls to us to write the next chapter in the saga of our people. Will we falter? Will we break? No. The response came as a roar, the fire of determination blazing in every face. Then let us fight. Not just with sword and shield, but with the strength of our faith, the wisdom of our ancestors, and the love we bear for this land and each other. As my words faded, a great cheer rose up, echoing off the fortress walls. I saw men and women standing taller, their faces set with grim determination. Even King Ethelred nodded in approval, a newfound respect in his eyes. In that moment, I knew that whatever trials lay ahead, we would face them together. Saxon and Christian blending the old ways with the new, we would forge a future worthy of the sacrifices of those who had come before us. As the defenders dispersed to their posts, I offered a silent prayer of thanks. The crucible of faith had tested me, had nearly broken me. But from that test, I had emerged stronger, my purpose clearer than ever before. The Vikings might renew their assault at any moment, but now we were ready. With faith in our hearts and steel in our hands, we would meet whatever challenges fate had in store for us. And in so doing, we would lay the foundation for a future brighter than any of us could imagine. The quill scratched softly against parchment as I, Brother Ethelred, once a simple scribe and now advisor to King Alfred the Great, recorded the events that had shaped our land. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls of my chamber in the newly built monastery of Winchester. Years had passed since those dark days of siege and strife. The boy prince I had once known had grown into a wise and just ruler, fulfilling the prophecy spoken so long ago by Bjorn Ironside. Under Alfred's guidance, our people had not only survived but thrived, forging a new identity that blended the old ways with the new. A knock at my door roused me from my reflections. "Enter," I called, setting aside my quill. King Alfred himself stepped into the room, a warm smile on his face. Though the crown of kingship rested upon his brow, I could still see traces of the curious young man I had known years ago. "Still at work, old friend?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "One might think you're trying to record every moment of our history." I chuckled, rising to greet him. "Someone must, Your Majesty. Our people have lived through times that should not be forgotten." Alfred nodded, his expression growing serious. "Indeed, and that is why I've come to you with a task of great importance." He laid out his vision, a grand project to translate key texts from Latin into Old English, making the wisdom of the ages accessible to all our people. "You want me to oversee this endeavor?" I asked, both honored and daunted by the prospect. "There is no one I trust more," Alfred replied. "Your knowledge of both our language and the classics is unparalleled." With the Norse influence growing stronger each day, it's vital that we preserve our Saxon heritage. And so began a new chapter in my life. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months as I worked tirelessly with a team of scholars. We translated religious texts, historical chronicles, and philosophical works. With each word rendered into our tongue, I felt as though we were building a bridge between past and future. One evening, as I pored over a particularly challenging passage of Boethius, a commotion in the courtyard drew my attention. Curious, I made my way outside to find a group of newly arrived Norse settlers being welcomed into the town. To my amazement, I saw Saxons greeting them not with suspicion, but with open arms. Children played together, heedless of their different origins. A burly Viking craftsman was deep in conversation with a Saxon blacksmith, both men gesticulating excitedly as they compared techniques. As I watched this scene unfold, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to find Edgith, a young Saxon woman I knew to be one of the most promising scholars in our translation project. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" she said, a smile playing at her lips. "Who would have thought, all those years ago, that we'd see such a day?" I nodded, still marveling at the scene before us. "Indeed. It seems the wounds of war are finally healing." Edgith's smile faltered slightly. "Not everyone is pleased with these changes, Brother Ethelred. There are those who fear we're losing our Saxon identity, becoming more Norse with each passing day." Her words struck a chord within me, echoing doubts I had harbored in my own heart. Before I could respond, however, a messenger approached bearing news that would once again alter the course of my life. King Alfred summoned me to his private chambers, his face grave as he shared the message he had received. The Danish king, Guthrum, was proposing a lasting peace treaty, and Alfred wanted me to be part of the negotiation team. "Me, Your Majesty?" I asked, stunned. "Surely there are others more qualified in matters of statecraft." Alfred shook his head, his eyes meeting mine with unwavering certainty. "You've lived among the Vikings, Ethelred. You understand their ways in a manner few of our people do. Moreover, you've shown time and again that you can bridge the gap between different cultures. I need your insight if we're to forge a lasting peace." And so once again, I found myself venturing into Norse territory. But this time, I went not as a spy or a refugee, but as an emissary of peace. The negotiations were tense, fraught with centuries of mistrust and bloodshed. Yet as the days wore on, I found myself drawing on all I had learned over the years, not just of Viking customs, but of our shared humanity. One evening, as we took a break from the formal talks, I found myself in conversation with a Norse chieftain named Halfdan. His weathered face bore the scars of many battles, yet his eyes held a weariness I recognized all too well. "Tell me, Christian," he said, his accent thick, but his English remarkably good. "Why do you strive so hard for this peace? You've seen the devastation my people have wrought upon yours. How can you set that aside?" I considered his question carefully before responding. "Because I've also seen the devastation war has wrought upon your people, Halfdan. I've seen mothers weep for lost sons, children orphaned by endless conflict. Saxon or Norse, we all bleed the same." Halfdan nodded slowly, a look of respect dawning in his eyes. "You speak wisely, monk. Perhaps it is time for the ravens to feast on something other than the slain." That conversation marked a turning point in the negotiations. Slowly but surely, we crafted a treaty that would divide the land, establishing the Dane law while preserving Saxon rule in Wessex. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a beginning, a chance for our peoples to coexist in peace. As I returned to Winchester, I found the world changing rapidly around me. Saxon and Norse customs began to blend, creating something entirely new. I watched with a mixture of fascination and trepidation as our languages melded, Norse words weaving their way into our everyday speech. One autumn day, as I walked through the streets of Winchester, I came upon a sight that stopped me in my tracks. A Saxon woman, her arm linked with that of a Norse warrior, both of them beaming as they announced their betrothal to a mixed group of well-wishers. Does it not warm your heart, Brother Ethelred? A voice beside me asked. I turned to see Edgith, her eyes shining as she watched the happy couple. It is. Certainly something I never thought I'd see, I admitted. Edgith laughed, a sound as bright as the autumn sunlight. The world is changing and we must change with it. But fear not. In your translations, in the stories we tell, the essence of who we are will endure. Her words stayed with me as I returned to my chambers that evening. Sitting at my desk, I pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and began to write. In the year of our Lord 899, I, Brother Ethelred, set down these words as a testament to the extraordinary times through which I have lived. As the candle burned low, I poured out my story, the tale of a simple monk thrust into the heart of history. I wrote of battles and sieges, of prophecies and miracles. I recounted the wisdom of King Alfred and the courage of countless unnamed heroes who had fought to preserve our way of life. But more than that, I wrote of the change I had witnessed, the slow, sometimes painful, but ultimately hopeful transformation of two warring peoples into one nation. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I penned the final words of my chronicle. And so, as I reach the twilight of my years, I look out upon a land transformed. Where once there was only strife, I now see the seeds of a great nation taking root. Saxon and Norse, Christian and pagan, all these threads are weaving together to create a tapestry more beautiful and enduring than any one tradition could produce alone. I do not know what the future holds for this land we now call England, but I have faith. Faith in the resilience of our people, in the wisdom of rulers like Alfred, and in the God who has guided us through our darkest hours. To you who read these words in years to come, know this. The journey that shaped our nation was not easy. It was forged in battle, tempered by suffering, and ultimately redeemed by the courage to change, to forgive, and to embrace a future bigger than the confines of our past. May you, the inheritors of this legacy, continue to build upon the foundation we have laid. May you face the challenges of your time with the same courage and wisdom that saw us through ours. And may you always remember that the truest strength lies not in conquest, but in the ability to build bridges between different peoples and ideas. With these words, I, Brother Ethelred, once a simple scribe and now a witness to history, lay down my quill. May God bless and keep this land of England, now and always. As I sealed the final page of my chronicle, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. My journey had been long and often difficult, but looking back, I could see the hand of Providence guiding each step. Rising from my desk, I walked to the window and looked out over the bustling town of Winchester. Saxon thanes mingled with Norse merchants in the marketplace. The sound of church bells mingled with the distant strains of a Norse ballad, and there, in the heart of it all, I saw a group of children, Saxon and Norse alike, playing together, their laughter rising up like a hymn to the future. In that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, the dawn of a new era had truly begun, and though I might not live to see it in its fullness, I had played my part in shaping a future brighter than any of us could have imagined in those dark days of war and strife. With a smile on my face and a prayer of gratitude in my heart, I turned back to my desk. There was still work to be done, still wisdom to be preserved for future generations. The wind howled across the rugged Icelandic landscape, carrying with it the scent of impending rain. I, Bjorn Thorson, stood before the ancient stone altar, my weathered hands gripping a ceremonial blade. The weight of tradition bore down upon me as heavily as the storm clouds gathering overhead. Mighty Thor, I intoned, my voice carrying over the whispers of my gathered kinsmen, accept this offering and grant us your protection. With practiced precision, I drew the blade across the throat of the young goat before me. Its lifeblood spilled onto the altar, seeping into the cracks of the weathered stone. As the last tremors left the animal's body, a peal of thunder rolled across the sky. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Asta, my wife, clutched our young daughter Frida closer to her side. Our son, Leif, stood tall beside them, his eyes fixed on the ritual with a mix of awe and unease that I couldn't quite comprehend. As I turned to face my people, I saw a range of emotions etched on their faces: reverence, fear, and something else: doubt. "The gods have spoken," I declared, raising my arms. "Thor accepts our sacrifice and promises a bountiful harvest." A cheer went up, but it felt hollow, lacking the fervor of years past. As the crowd began to disperse, my old friend Halvor approached, his brow furrowed with concern. "Bjorn," he said in a low voice, "we need to talk." I nodded, wiping the blood from my hands with a scrap of linen. "What troubles you, my friend?" Halvor glanced around, ensuring we wouldn't be overheard. "Word has reached us from the south. Christian missionaries are making their way up the coast, converting villages as they go." My blood ran cold, but I forced a laugh. "Let them come. Our people have withstood harsher storms than a few priests with their foreign god." "It's not just a few priests, Bjorn," Halvor insisted. "They bring with them the backing of powerful jarls who have already converted. Some say even the king himself may soon embrace this new faith." I felt my jaw clench. Then they are all fools. Our gods have protected these lands for generations. Why would we abandon them now? Before Halvor could respond, Asta approached with the children in tow. Her eyes darted between us, sensing the tension. "Is everything all right?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Of course, my love. Halvor was just sharing some gossip from the south. Nothing for us to worry about." Asta's gaze lingered on me, unconvinced. "Very well. Leif, Frida, say goodbye to your father. We should return home before the storm hits." As my family turned to leave, Leif hesitated. "Father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is it true what they say about the Christian God? That he doesn't demand blood sacrifices?" I felt a flicker of anger, quickly suppressed. "Who's been filling your head with such nonsense, boy?" Leif shrank back. I just heard some of the other children talking." I knelt before him, placing my hands on his shoulders. "Listen to me, son. Our gods are strong and just. They demand sacrifice because they understand the value of what they give us in return. Never forget that." Leif nodded, but I could see the questions still swimming in his eyes as he hurried after his mother and sister. As the last of the villagers departed, I made my way to the small hut where our vulva, Hilda, resided. The old seeress had been a fixture in our village for as long as anyone could remember, her wisdom revered by all. I ducked through the low doorway, the smell of herbs and incense enveloping me. Hilda sat by the fire, her milky eyes seeming to pierce right through me. "I've been expecting you, Bjorn Thorson," she said, her voice creaking like old wood. "Then you know why I've come," I replied, settling onto a stool across from her. Hilda nodded slowly. "The winds of change blow strong, carrying with them the scent of foreign incense and the whispers of a new god." "What would you have me do?" I asked, leaning forward. "How can I protect our people, our ways?" The old woman was silent for a long moment, stirring the flames with a gnarled stick. Finally, she spoke. "The path ahead is shrouded in mist, Bjorn. But know this, the gods have not abandoned us. They watch and they wait. Your faith will be tested as never before." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Speak plainly, vulva. What do you see?" Hilda's unseeing eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the confines of her humble dwelling. "I see a great upheaval. Brother will turn against brother, father against son. The old ways will be challenged and many will falter. But from this turmoil, a new understanding may emerge, if you have the wisdom to grasp it." I left Hilda's hut with more questions than answers, my mind churning with possibilities and fears. The rain had begun to fall in earnest, and I hurried to the great hall where the Thing, our assembly of freemen, had already gathered. As I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, I was met with a cacophony of raised voices. The hall was divided, with men arguing heatedly on either side. At the center stood Erikr, our chieftain, attempting to restore order. Silence! Eriker bellowed, his voice cutting through the din. As the room quieted, he continued, "We must approach this matter with clear heads. The arrival of these Christian missionaries is not necessarily a threat." A chorus of protests erupted, and I found myself shouting above the rest. "Not a threat? They seek to strip away everything that makes us who we are." Eriker fixed me with a stern gaze. "And who are we, Bjorn? Are we defined solely by the gods we worship, or by the strength of our community, the bonds between us?" I felt my face flush with anger. Those bonds are forged in the traditions passed down to us by our ancestors, traditions honored by the gods themselves. As the ship drew closer, I could make out the figures on deck. Their robes were unlike anything I'd seen before, and at their head stood a man whose very presence seemed to command attention. This, I knew, must be the priest I'd heard so much about. I watched in silence as they disembarked, greeted by Eriker and a small welcoming party. Even from this distance, I could see the curiosity on my people's faces. It made my stomach churn. Later that day, as I walked through the village, I overheard excited whispers. "Did you see them? They say their God is one of peace and love. I heard the priest can perform miracles. They're holding a gathering tonight. We should go listen." Each word was like a dagger to my heart. How quickly my people seemed to forget the gods who had watched over us for generations. As the sun began to set, I noticed a crowd gathering in the village square. At its center stood the Christian priest, his voice carrying over the assembled villagers. "Friends," he called out, his accent strange but his words clear, "I bring you tidings of great joy. For too long you have lived in darkness, but now the light of the one true God has come to your shores." I pushed my way through the crowd, determined to confront this intruder. But as I broke through to the front, I froze. There, hanging on every word, was my childhood friend, Bjorn. Our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of guilt cross his face. He quickly looked away, focusing once more on the priest's words. "In Christ there is no need for blood sacrifice, no fear of capricious gods," the priest continued. "Only love, forgiveness, and the promise of eternal life." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. I'd heard enough. Turning on my heel, I stormed away, my mind reeling. Later that night, as I sat brooding by the fire in my home, a knock came at the door. It was Bjorn. "May I come in, old friend?" he asked hesitantly. I grunted in response, not meeting his eyes as he entered and sat across from me. "Bjorn," I began, my voice low, "what were you doing there today?" He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I was listening, Bjorn, just listening. Is that so wrong? Listening to blasphemy? To lies that would turn us away from the gods who have protected us?" I spat. "And what if they're not lies?" Bjorn countered, his voice rising. "What if there's truth in what they say? A God of love, of forgiveness? Doesn't that sound appealing after all the bloodshed we've seen?" I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. Appealing? It sounds weak. Our gods understand the harsh realities of this world. They don't promise easy solutions or fairy tales of eternal peace. Bjorn rose as well, his eyes pleading. "I'm not saying I believe it all, not yet. But I'm interested, Bjorn. After all we've been through, don't we owe it to ourselves to at least consider another way?" "Consider all you want," I growled. "But don't expect me to stand by and watch as you betray everything our ancestors believed in." With that, Bjorn left, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and whispered conversations. I threw myself into my daily tasks, trying to ignore the growing crowd that gathered each evening to hear the priest speak. It was on the fourth day that my world truly began to crumble. I was returning from the fields when I spotted my daughter Frida, slipping out of the forest path that led to the makeshift chapel the Christians had erected. Her head was bowed, and she clutched something to her chest. "Frida!" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. She startled, quickly hiding whatever she was holding behind her back. "Father, I didn't see you there." I strode towards her, my heart pounding. What were you doing in the forest? And what are you hiding?" "Nothing, father," she stammered, but I could see the fear in her eyes. With a swift motion, I reached behind her and snatched the object from her grasp. It was a small wooden cross, crudely carved but unmistakable in its symbolism. "What is this?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. Tears welled up in Frida's eyes. "Please, father, I was just curious. The priest, he speaks of such wonderful things, of a god who—" "Enough!" I roared, causing her to flinch. "No daughter of mine will fall for these foreign lies. Go home now. We'll discuss this later." As Frida ran off sobbing, I stood there, the cross clutched so tightly in my hand that it dug into my flesh. A red haze descended over my vision. This abomination had now infected my own family. It had to be stopped. That night, under the cover of darkness, I made my way to the Christian chapel. It was a simple structure, little more than a large tent with a wooden frame. But to me, it represented everything that threatened to destroy my world. With a roar of anguish and rage, I tore into the chapel. I ripped down hangings, smashed crude benches, and toppled the altar they had erected. In my frenzy, I hardly noticed the commotion I was causing until it was too late. "Stop! In the name of God, stop!" I whirled around to see the priest standing in the entrance, his face a mask of shock and sorrow. Behind him, villagers were gathering, drawn by the noise. "Look!" the priest called out to the crowd. "See how fear and hatred drive this man to destroy what he does not understand." Shame and defiance warred within me as I faced the growing crowd. I saw anger in their eyes, disappointment, and pity. That more than anything fueled my rage. "You're all fools!" I shouted. "Can't you see what's happening? These outsiders come to strip away our identity, to make us forget who we are." But my words fell on deaf ears. As Eriker pushed through the crowd, his face grim, I knew my actions had only served to drive my people further away. "Bjorn Thorson," Eriker intoned, his voice heavy with authority, "you have violated our laws and our hospitality. You will answer for this before the thing." As I was led away, my gaze fell upon my family in the crowd. Asta's face was a mask of disappointment, Leif looked away in shame, and Frida was weeping in the arms of the Christian priest. In that moment I realized that in my zeal to protect our old ways, I might have lost everything that truly mattered. The night after my punishment was decided, a hefty fine and public apology, I tossed and turned in my bed, sleep eluding me. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were vivid and unsettling. I found myself standing in a misty forest clearing, the air thick with an otherworldly presence. Before me materialized a figure, tall and imposing, with a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. One eye gleamed in the darkness, piercing and all-knowing. "Odin," I breathed, falling to my knees. The Allfather's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Rise, Bjorn Thorson. The time for kneeling is past. Now is the time for action." I stood, my heart pounding. "Great Odin, I have tried to defend our ways, but my people turn from me. What more can I do?" Odin's single eye seemed to bore into my soul. "The old ways are not merely rituals and sacrifices, Bjorn. They are the wisdom of ages, the strength of our people. You must become their keeper, their guardian." "But how?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "Gather those who remember. Teach those who would learn. The flames of our traditions must not die out." Odin's form began to fade. "Remember, Bjorn, in the darkest night, the fire burns brightest." I awoke with a start, sweat beading on my brow. The dream felt more real than the waking world, Odin's words echoing in my mind. I knew then what I had to do. Over the next few days, I quietly reached out to those I knew still held the old gods in their hearts. We met in secret, deep in the forest, where the Christians rarely ventured. "Friends," I addressed the small gathering, my voice low but intense. "We stand at a crossroads. Our ways, the ways of our fathers and their fathers before them, are being forgotten, but we cannot let the wisdom of ages slip away. Gunhild, an elder woman known for her knowledge of herbal lore, spoke up. "What can we do, Bjorn? The village turns more to the White Christ with each passing day." "We keep the old ways alive," I replied firmly. "We practice our rituals, we tell our stories, we pass on our knowledge, and we do it in secret if we must." Young Halfdan, barely a man, looked nervous. "But what if we're discovered? The priest speaks of their god's forgiveness, but I've heard tales of how they treat those who cling to the old gods in other lands." I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then we must be cautious but not afraid. Odin himself has charged us with this task. We cannot fail." As our clandestine meetings continued, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't known in weeks. But at home, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. One evening, as I prepared to slip out to another gathering, Asta confronted me. "Where are you going, Bjorn?" she demanded, her eyes flashing. I hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. I have business to attend to." "Don't lie to me," she hissed. "I know you're meeting with others who cling to the old ways. Do you realize what you're risking? What you're putting our family through?" I felt my temper rising. "I'm fighting for our traditions, for our very identity. How can you not see the importance of this?" Asta's voice cracked with emotion. "And what of our children's future? Leif and Frida are already outcasts because of your actions. If you continue down this path..." She took a deep breath. "If you don't reconsider your stance, I'll have no choice but to leave with the children. I won't let your stubbornness ruin their lives." Her words hit me like a physical blow. "Asta, please," I pleaded, reaching for her, but she pulled away. "Think carefully about what truly matters, Bjorn," she said softly before turning and walking away. I stood there, torn between my conviction and my love for my family. The weight of my choices had never felt heavier. The next day, as I sat alone by the shore, lost in thought, a familiar voice broke through my reverie. "May I join you, Bjorn Thorson?" I looked up to see the Christian priest, Father Matthias, standing nearby. Every instinct told me to send him away, but something in his expression gave me pause. "If you must," I grunted, gesturing to the rock beside me. Father Matthias sat, his movements careful as if approaching a wild animal. For a while, we sat in silence, watching the waves. Finally, he spoke. "I know we have been at odds, Bjorn, but I wonder if perhaps we have more in common than you might think." I scoffed. "What could we possibly have in common, priest?" "A deep love for our people. A desire to guide them towards what we believe is right and true." He turned to face me. "I've heard of your passion, your dedication to your gods. While I may not agree with your beliefs, I respect the strength of your conviction." His words surprised me, and I found myself studying him more closely. "What are you proposing?" "A dialogue," he replied. "An open, public discussion of our beliefs. No accusations, no attempts at conversion. Simply an exchange of ideas, so that our people might better understand both paths." I narrowed my eyes, suspicious. "And what would you gain from this?" Father Matthias smiled gently. "Understanding, and perhaps a chance to show that Christians and pagans need not be enemies." I mulled over his words. A public debate could be risky, but it might also be an opportunity to sway minds back to the old gods, to remind people of the strength and wisdom our traditions offered. After a long moment, I nodded slowly. "Very well, priest. I accept your proposal." As Father Matthias departed, a mix of emotions swirled within me. Anxiety, certainly, but also a glimmer of hope. This debate could be my chance to reignite the flames of our traditions in the hearts of our people. That night, as I shared the news with my secret group of pagans, opinions were divided. "It's a trap," old Gunhild warned. "They'll twist your words and make you look foolish." But young Halfdan's eyes shone with excitement. "Or it could be our chance to show everyone the power and beauty of our ways." As the discussion raged on, I stood firm in my decision. This is our opportunity to speak openly, to remind our people of who we are and where we come from. I will not squander it. Later, as I prepared for bed, Asta approached me. Her expression was guarded, but I could see a hint of softening in her eyes. I heard about the debate, she said quietly. It's a more reasonable approach than I expected from you. I took her hand gently. I'm trying, Asta. For our family, for our people. I have to believe there's a way forward that doesn't require abandoning everything we are. She squeezed my hand in return, a small gesture that filled me with hope. Just be careful, Bjorn. There's much at stake. As I drifted off to sleep that night, my mind raced with arguments and counter-arguments. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of purpose and direction. Come what may, I would stand before my people and speak for the gods who had watched over us for generations. The real challenge had only just begun. The day of the debate dawned clear and bright, as if the gods themselves were watching with interest. The village square buzzed with anticipation as people gathered, their excited whispers filling the air. At the center, 2 chairs had been placed facing each other, with Eriker's larger seat positioned between them as moderator. I stood to the side, my stomach churning with a mix of nervousness and determination. Across the square, I saw Father Matthias in quiet conversation with some of his followers. He caught my eye and nodded respectfully. I returned the gesture stiffly. Asta approached me, Leif and Frida in tow. Remember, she said softly, speak from your heart, but listen with your head. She squeezed my hand before leading the children to their seats. As the sun reached its zenith, Eriker called for silence. Today, his voice boomed across the square, we gather to hear 2 perspectives on faith. May this debate bring understanding, not division. He gestured for Father Matthias and me to take our seats. I settled into my chair, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes upon us. Eriker spoke again. Bjorn Thorson will open our debate, speaking on behalf of our traditional gods. Taking a deep breath, I stood. People of our village, friends, family, I stand before you today to speak of the gods who have watched over us since time immemorial. Thor, whose might protects us. Odin, whose wisdom guides us. Freya, whose love blesses us. I paused, scanning the crowd. These are not distant, unknowable beings, but forces woven into the very fabric of our lives, our land, our identity. I continued, my voice growing stronger. Our traditions have seen us through harsh winters, bountiful harvests, and everything in between. They connect us to our ancestors and to the land itself. To abandon them would be to lose a part of ourselves. As I spoke, I saw nods of agreement from some, while others listened with skeptical expressions. I pressed on, detailing the rich tapestry of our myths and the practical wisdom embedded in our rituals. When I finished, there was a smattering of applause. I sat down, my heart pounding but feeling confident. Father Matthias rose next, his demeanor calm and friendly. My friends, he began, his accent lending his words an exotic flair. I have listened with great interest to Bjorn's words. Indeed, the love for one's traditions is admirable. He smiled warmly. But I come to offer you something more. A personal relationship with a loving God who seeks not your fear but your love. He went on to speak of forgiveness, of eternal life, of a divine plan for each person. His words were honeyed, and I watched with growing unease as many in the crowd leaned forward, captivated. Imagine, Father Matthias continued, a God who doesn't demand blood sacrifices, who doesn't punish arbitrarily, but who loves each of you unconditionally. I noticed several people nodding, including, to my dismay, my own son, Leif. When Father Matthias finished, the applause was noticeably louder than it had been for me. Eriker then opened the floor for us to question each other. I leaned forward, eager to challenge the priest. You speak of love and forgiveness, but what of strength? What of the harsh realities of life? Our gods understand the need for sacrifice, for battle. How does your singular God prepare people for the hardships of this world? Father Matthias nodded thoughtfully. A fair question, Bjorn. Our God doesn't shield us from hardships but gives us the strength to endure them. The sacrifice was made by his Son, Jesus Christ, so that we wouldn't have to make them ourselves. His answer seemed to resonate with many, and I felt my confidence waver. But before I could press further, Father Matthias posed his own question. Bjorn, you speak of sacrifice. Can you explain to us the morality of human sacrifice, a practice that I understand has been part of your traditions in the past? The crowd gasped. I felt the blood drain from my face. Human sacrifice was indeed part of our most ancient traditions, but it was rarely practiced now and never spoken of openly. I stammered, trying to collect my thoughts. Our ancestors understood that sometimes the greatest problems require the greatest sacrifices, but it was never done lightly, never without. But it was done. Father Matthias interrupted gently. Can you truly defend a belief system that would demand the life of an innocent? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw looks of disgust on some faces, uncertainty on others. Even some of my staunchest supporters seemed shaken. Desperation clawed at me. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the ground. You speak of things you don't understand, priest. Our gods are real, present, powerful. Thor, I shouted to the sky, my voice cracking. Great Thunderer, show these people your might. Demonstrate your power so that they might remember their true faith. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to the sky. Seconds stretched into minutes. The clear blue sky remained unchanged, not a cloud in sight. Father Matthias broke the silence, his voice soft and almost pitying. Perhaps, Bjorn, it's not about demonstrations of power, but manifestations of love. I sank back into my chair, humiliation washing over me. The debate continued, but I barely heard the words. My mind was reeling, my certainty shaken for the first time in my life. As the sun began to set, Eriker called an end to the debate. We thank both Bjorn and Father Matthias for their words today. Let us all reflect on what we've heard. The crowd began to disperse, many gathering around Father Matthias with questions. A few approached me with words of support, but most avoided my gaze. Asta found me still sitting in my chair, staring blankly ahead. Bjorn, she said softly, let's go home. I looked up at her, then at Leif and Frida standing behind her. Leif's expression was unreadable, but Frida's eyes were filled with a mixture of confusion and concern. As we walked home in silence, the weight of the day pressed down on me. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a terrifying question. What if I've been wrong all along? That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, replaying the debate in my mind, hearing the silence that followed my desperate plea to Thor. The certainty that had anchored my entire life suddenly felt fragile, like ice cracking beneath my feet. As the first light of dawn crept through our window, I made a decision. My faith might be shaken, but I wasn't ready to abandon it entirely. There had to be a way forward, a way to honor our traditions while addressing the doubts that now plagued me. The days following the debate were a blur of confusion and inner turmoil. I wandered through the village like a ghost, aware of the whispers and sidelong glances that followed me. My once unshakable faith now felt like a threadbare cloak, offering little protection against the chill winds of doubt. It was on a crisp morning, as I returned from a solitary walk in the woods, that my world truly began to crumble. I entered our home to find Asta sitting at the table, her face pale and drawn. Leif stood beside her, his chin raised defiantly, but his eyes betraying a mix of fear and determination. Father, Leif began, his voice quavering slightly. There's something I need to tell you. I felt a knot form in my stomach. What is it, son? Leif took a deep breath. I've been baptized. I've accepted Christ as my savior. The words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, gripping the doorframe for support. You? What? I whispered, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. I've been attending the Christian services in secret, Leif continued, his voice growing stronger. Their message of love and forgiveness, it speaks to me in a way our old gods never have. Rage and despair warred within me. I lunged forward, grabbing Leif by the shoulders. How could you do this? How could you betray everything I've taught you? Everything our ancestors believed in? Bjorn, stop, Asta cried, pulling me away from our son. Can't you see? This is exactly why he kept it secret. He knew you wouldn't understand. I rounded on her. And you? Did you know about this? Asta's eyes fell. Not until today. But Bjorn... She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. I can't say I'm entirely opposed to it. It felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. What are you saying, Asta? She met my gaze, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I'm saying that I have doubts, Bjorn. Doubts about the old ways, about the gods we've worshipped. Seeing how this new faith has brought peace to so many in our village, including our son, it's made me question everything. I stumbled back, feeling as if I'd been struck. Et tu, Asta? You too would abandon our ways. I'm not abandoning anything yet, she said firmly. But I can't ignore the changes happening around us, or the doubts in my own heart. I looked between my wife and son, suddenly feeling like a stranger in my own home. Without another word, I turned and fled, unable to bear the weight of their confessions. I wandered aimlessly through the village, my mind reeling. Everywhere I looked, I saw signs of change. The old runes carved into doorposts were being replaced with crosses. Children played games I didn't recognize, singing songs about saints and angels. As I approached the village center, I saw a crowd gathering. At its heart stood Erikr, our chieftain, his voice ringing out clear and strong. People of our village, he proclaimed, we stand at a crossroads of history. For generations, we have followed the old ways, honoring the gods of our ancestors. But times change, and we must change with them. My heart sank as I realized what was coming. After much deliberation and counsel, Erikr continued, I have decided that for the good of our people and our future, we shall embrace the Christian faith as the official religion of our village. A cheer went up from many in the crowd, while others murmured in discontent. I stood frozen, feeling as if the very earth was shifting beneath my feet. Erikr raised his hands for silence. This does not mean we forsake our heritage or our traditions entirely, but from this day forward we look to the Christian God for guidance and protection. As the crowd dispersed, some celebrating, others debating, I caught sight of Father Matthias. Our eyes met, and I saw not triumph in his gaze, but a mixture of relief and concern. He started to approach me, but I turned away, unable to face him. My feet carried me to the edge of the village, to the sacred grove where we had performed our rituals for generations. As I approached, I sensed something was wrong. The air felt different, the usual sense of power and mystery absent. I broke into a run, bursting through the tree line into the clearing. What I saw brought me to my knees. The ancient idols, carved by our ancestors and imbued with centuries of reverence, lay broken and scattered on the ground. The altar stone was overturned, the runes defaced. In the center of the desecration stood a crudely fashioned wooden cross. A keening wail escaped my lips, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the deserted grove. I crawled to the nearest fallen idol, cradling its broken form in my arms. How could they do this? I sobbed, rocking back and forth. How could they forget you so easily? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruined grove, a deep despair settled over me. Everything I had believed in, everything I had fought for, seemed to be crumbling away. In that moment of utter desolation, a dark thought crept into my mind. I picked up a jagged piece of the broken idol, its edge glinting in the fading light. It would be so easy, I thought, to join my ancestors in Valhalla, to escape this world that no longer made sense. I raised the makeshift blade, my hand trembling. But just as I was about to act, a harsh cry split the air. A raven, black as night, landed on the overturned altar stone. It fixed me with its beady eye, cawing once more. I froze, the shard slipping from my fingers. Odin's ravens, I thought. Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. Was this a sign? The raven tilted its head, regarding me with what seemed like expectation. Then with a final caw, it spread its wings and took flight, disappearing into the gathering dusk. I sat there for a long moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The despair that had nearly consumed me began to recede, replaced by a new emotion, determination. No, I whispered, then louder, no. I will not give up so easily. If the old ways are to survive, they need a guardian, a keeper of the ancient knowledge. I stood, brushing the dirt from my clothes. As I looked around the desecrated grove, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to preserve our traditions, to keep the old gods alive, even if I had to do it alone. With a heavy heart, but a renewed sense of purpose, I made my way back to the village. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges I could scarcely imagine. But for the first time since the debate, I felt a flicker of hope. As I approached my home, I steeled myself for the difficult conversations that lay ahead. The night air bit at my skin as I slipped away from the village, a small pack of supplies on my back and determination in my heart. The weight of my decision pressed heavily upon me, but I knew I could not stay. Not when everything I held sacred was being dismantled around me. As I reached the edge of the forest, I paused, looking back at the flickering lights of the village, my home for all my life. "Forgive me," I whispered, thinking of Asta and the children. Then I turned and plunged into the darkness of the woods. For days, I wandered deeper into the wilderness, surviving on foraged berries and the few supplies I had brought. The forest, once a place of comfort and spiritual connection, now seemed alien and foreboding. Yet I pressed on, driven by a promise I had made to myself and to the old gods. It was on the 5th day, as I huddled beneath a great oak to escape a sudden downpour, that I heard it, a faint chanting carried on the wind. My heart leaped. Could it be? Cautiously, I moved towards the sound, my hand on the hilt of my knife. As I crept closer, I began to make out words, ancient words, prayers to Thor and Odin. A surge of emotion threatened to overwhelm me. Suddenly, a voice rang out. "Halt! Who goes there?" I froze, then slowly raised my hands. "I am Bjorn Thorson," I called out, a follower of the old ways seeking refuge from Christian persecution. There was a moment of tense silence. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, her gray hair wild and her eyes sharp. She carried a spear and wore the symbols of our gods around her neck. "Bjorn Thorson," she said, her voice softening slightly. "We've heard of you, the one who debated the Christian priest." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Come. There are others you should meet." She led me through a hidden path to a clearing where a small group had gathered around a fire. Men, women, even a few children, all wearing the symbols of our gods, all looking at me with a mixture of hope and wariness. An older man with a braided beard stepped forward. "I am Halvor," he said. "Once a Godi of a northern village, now a refugee like yourself. What brings you to our hidden grove, Bjorn Thorson?" I told them my story, the debate, the betrayal, the desecration of our sacred spaces. As I spoke, I saw nods of understanding and murmurs of shared pain. When I finished, Halvor placed a hand on my shoulder. "You are among friends here, Bjorn. We too have fled our homes to keep the old ways alive. Together we can ensure our traditions do not die." Over the next few weeks, our small community grew as more refugees found their way to us. We built simple shelters, foraged and hunted for food, and most importantly, we practiced our faith. Under the cover of darkness, we would gather in a hidden clearing to perform the ancient rituals. One night, as the moon hung full and bright above us, we prepared for a blot to honor Thor. I stood before the crude altar we had fashioned, raising the sacrificial blade. "Mighty Thor," I intoned, my voice carrying through the night air, "we, your faithful, call upon you in these dark times. Grant us your strength, your protection, as we fight to keep your memory alive." As I completed the sacrifice, a roll of thunder sounded in the distance. A ripple of awe passed through the gathered crowd. "A sign," someone whispered. "Thor has heard us." The ritual continued, and for the first time since fleeing my village, I felt truly connected to the gods again. As we sang the ancient songs and shared the sacrificial meat, I saw the same feeling reflected in the faces around me. But our refuge was not without its challenges. One day, a newcomer arrived, bringing grim news from the outside world. "They're cracking down hard on anyone suspected of practicing the old ways," he told us, his voice shaking. "I saw a man flogged in the town square for wearing Thor's hammer. They say in some villages they're burning people as witches." A hush fell over our group. I saw fear in many eyes, but also a hardening of resolve. Halvor spoke up, his voice firm. "This is why our work here is so important. We must keep the knowledge alive, so that when this madness passes, our people will remember who they truly are." As the others nodded in agreement, I felt a pang of guilt. My thoughts turned to Asta, to Leif and Frida. Were they safe? Did they worry for me? The weight of my choice to leave them behind pressed heavily upon my heart. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered to the edge of our hidden community. The moon cast long shadows through the trees, and in the distance, I could just make out the glow of village fires. "Troubled, Bjorn?" a voice said softly behind me. I turned to see Astrid, the woman who had first found me in the forest. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "You're thinking of your family," she said. It wasn't a question. "I left them," I said, the words bitter in my mouth. "To protect our ways, I abandoned those I swore to protect." Astrid was quiet for a long moment. "We all made sacrifices to be here," she finally said. "I left behind grandchildren. Halvor left a wife of 40 years. But we do this not just for ourselves, but for them too, so that one day they might remember the truth of their heritage." Her words brought little comfort, but I appreciated the sentiment. And if they never understand? If they live and die thinking us fools or heretics? "Then we will have done our duty nonetheless," Astrid said firmly. "The gods know our hearts, Bjorn. They understand our sacrifices." As we stood there in silence, watching the distant fires, I felt torn between two worlds. The pull of family, of the life I had known, warred with my duty to the gods and our traditions. It was a battle I knew would rage within me for a long time to come. But as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to bridge these two worlds. Somehow I would protect the old ways while also protecting those I loved. The path forward was unclear, but I knew I had to try. With a deep breath, I turned back to our hidden community. The moon hung low and full in the sky as I sat in quiet meditation at the edge of our hidden community. Months had passed since I'd fled my village, and while our small band of pagans had grown stronger, the ache in my heart for my family had never truly subsided. As I sat there, eyes closed and mind open, a sudden warmth enveloped me. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in a golden hall, more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. Before me stood a radiant woman, her eyes filled with wisdom and compassion. "Frigg," I breathed, recognizing the queen of the Aesir. She smiled gently. "Bjorn Thorson, your devotion has not gone unnoticed, but there is more to life than clinging to the past. It is time for you to return home and make peace." "But my lady," I protested, "what of our ways? Who will keep them alive if we all return?" Frigg's expression turned serious. "The old ways live in the hearts of those who remember, Bjorn. They do not require hidden groves and secret rituals to survive. Go home. Reconcile with your family and your people. This is the will of the gods." Before I could respond, the vision faded, and I found myself back in the forest, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The next morning I gathered our small community to share my vision and my decision. "You can't be serious," Halvor exclaimed, his face a mask of disbelief. "Return to those who would persecute us?" I held up my hand to calm the murmurs of agreement. "I must follow the guidance of the gods. Frigg herself has shown me this path. But know this, I go not to abandon our ways, but to find a new way to preserve them." Astrid stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We cannot stop you, Bjorn, but know that you will always have a place among us, should you need it." With heavy hearts and words of caution, my friends bid me farewell. As I set out on the long journey home, their blessings and concerns echoed in my mind. Days later, I crested the final hill overlooking my village. My heart raced as I approached my home, but as I drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The door hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, I found only dust and silence. "Asta?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty rooms. "Leif? Frida?" But there was no response. My family was gone. Confused and heartbroken, I wandered into the village square. A few people recognized me, their expressions a mix of surprise and wariness. Then a familiar voice called out, "Bjorn? Bjorn Thorson, is that you?" I turned to see Father Matthias approaching, his face etched with concern. "Where is my family?" I demanded, my voice harsher than I intended. The priest's expression softened. "Come with me, Bjorn. You look exhausted and half-starved. Let's get you some food, and I'll tell you what I know." Too tired to argue, I followed him to the small church. Inside, he offered me bread and mead, which I accepted gratefully. As I ate, Father Matthias spoke. "Your family left the village about a month after you disappeared. Asta, she was worried sick about you, Bjorn, but she also feared for the children's safety given the tensions your departure had caused." I felt a pang of guilt at his words. "Where did they go?" "To the neighboring village of Ravenholt," he replied. "Asta has family there. They thought it best to make a fresh start." I nodded slowly, processing this information. Then, looking at the priest, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind. "Why are you helping me, Father? After everything that happened?" Father Matthias smiled gently. "Because it's what my faith teaches me to do, Bjorn. To offer compassion and aid, even to those who might consider me an enemy." His kindness caught me off guard, challenging the assumptions I'd held about the Christian faith. We talked long into the night, sharing our beliefs and finding, to my surprise, more common ground than I'd ever imagined possible. As dawn broke, I rose to leave. "Thank you for your kindness, Father. I must go to Ravenholt now, to find my family." Father Matthias nodded. "I understand. But Bjorn, be careful. There are those in the village who still harbor resentment over your actions before you left. It might be wise to leave quietly." I took his advice, slipping out of the village as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky. But as I reached the outskirts, a shout rang out. "There he is. The pagan who desecrated our church." Before I could react, I found myself surrounded by a group of men, their faces twisted with anger. "Please," I said, raising my hands. "I mean no harm. I'm only passing through." But my words fell on deaf ears. One of the men, a burly farmer I recognized, stepped forward. "You'll answer for your crimes, Thorson. Seize him." As they grabbed me, I briefly considered fighting back. But Frigg's words echoed in my mind. I had come to make peace, not to sow more discord. So I allowed them to bind my hands, my heart heavy with the realization that my journey home had taken yet another unexpected turn. As they led me back to the village, I caught sight of Father Matthias watching from the steps of the church, his face a mask of concern and disappointment. I gave him a small nod, trying to convey my understanding and lack of ill will. The men threw me into a small storage shed that had been converted into a makeshift jail. As the door slammed shut, I heard one of them say, "The chieftain will decide what to do with him when he returns tomorrow." Alone in the dim light, I sank to the floor, my mind racing. I'd come so close to reuniting with my family only to find myself farther from them than ever. But as I sat there, I realized that this, too, must be part of the path the gods had set before me. I closed my eyes, offering a silent prayer to Frigg. "Give me strength," I whispered. "Help me find a way to bridge these two worlds, to make peace not just with my family, but with my people." As night fell, I drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of golden halls and the faces of those I loved. Whatever trials lay ahead, I knew I had to face them. The dawn broke cold and gray as I was led from my makeshift cell to the village square. A crowd had already gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, anger, and pity. At the center stood a hastily constructed platform where the village elders sat, ready to pass judgment. As I was brought before them, I saw familiar faces among the tribunal. There was Erikr, our chieftain, his face stern and unreadable. Beside him sat Gunnar, the village's most respected warrior, and Helga, our wise woman turned Christian convert. Erikr stood, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "Bjorn Thorson, you stand accused of heresy against the Christian faith and of inciting unrest in our village. How do you plead?" I straightened my back, meeting his gaze. "I plead only that I have followed the dictates of my conscience and the will of the gods I believe in." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Erikr frowned. "That is no plea, Bjorn. You must answer, guilty or not guilty." Before I could respond, a voice called out from the crowd, "Wait!" To my shock, I saw my old friend Eric pushing his way to the front. Eric, who had been one of the first to convert to Christianity, who had turned his back on me during the debates. "I would speak for the accused," Eric declared, climbing onto the platform. Erikr looked surprised but nodded. "Speak then, Eric Haraldsson, but know that by defending him you risk your own standing in this community." Eric took a deep breath, his eyes meeting mine for a moment before he turned to address the crowd. "I have known Bjorn Thorson since we were boys. He is a man of honor, of conviction. Yes, he clings to the old ways, but can we truly condemn him for staying true to the beliefs we all once shared?" His words caused a stir among the villagers. I saw some nodding in agreement, while others scowled in disapproval. Eric continued, his voice growing stronger. "We speak of Christian virtues, of forgiveness, of compassion. Should we not extend these to Bjorn? He has harmed no one. His only crime is believing differently than we do now." As Eric stepped back, the crowd erupted in debate. I could hear voices calling for my execution, decrying me as a heathen and a troublemaker. But there were others, to my surprise, who echoed Eric's call for mercy. Erikr raised his hands for silence. "We have heard from a defender. Who will speak for the prosecution?" Helga stood, her once kind eyes now hard as she looked at me. "Bjorn Thorson may not have physically harmed anyone, but his stubborn adherence to pagan ways threatens the very soul of our community. How can we move forward into this new era of faith if we allow such heresy to persist?" She turned to address the crowd directly. "Remember the discord he sowed with his debates? The unrest that followed his disappearance? As long as Bjorn clings to the old gods, he will be a source of division among us." Her words seemed to sway many in the crowd, and I felt a sinking in my stomach. But then another voice spoke up, one I had not expected to hear in my defense. "If I may, I would like to offer a perspective," said Father Matthias, stepping forward. Erikr nodded, curiosity evident on his face. "Speak, Father. Your words carry great weight in this matter." Father Matthias climbed onto the platform, his gentle eyes meeting mine before he turned to the tribunal and the crowd. "My brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, "I understand the fear and anger many of you feel. But I must remind you of the core tenets of our faith. Did our Lord not teach us to love our enemies, to forgive those who trespass against us?" He paused, letting his words sink in. "Bjorn Thorson may not share our beliefs, but he is still a member of this community. A husband, a father, a friend to many here. Our faith teaches us mercy and compassion. Let us show Bjorn the true power of Christian love by extending forgiveness, not condemnation." His words seemed to touch many hearts. I saw tears in some eyes, thoughtful expressions on faces that had been angry moments before. Erikr stood, his face troubled. We have heard impassioned arguments on both sides. We will now deliberate. The elders huddled together, their whispered debate lasting what felt like an eternity. Finally, Erikr turned back to address the crowd. Bjorn Thorson, he said, his voice heavy. While some have called for your death, we cannot bring ourselves to such an extreme measure. However, your presence here is a source of discord we cannot ignore. He paused, and I held my breath. Therefore, we sentence you to exile. You will leave this village and not return on pain of death. A mix of reactions swept through the crowd, relief from some, disappointment from others. But Erikr wasn't finished. However, he continued, we will offer you one chance to remain. Here and now, before all these witnesses, if you renounce your pagan faith and accept Christ as your Savior, you may stay among us as a full member of our community. The square fell silent, all eyes turning to me. I felt the weight of their gazes, the expectation hanging heavy in the air. For a moment I was tempted. The thought of reuniting with my family, of returning to the life I had known, pulled at my heart. But then I remembered Frigg's words, the mission she had given me. I thought of our hidden community in the forest, of the ancient ways that lived on through us. And I knew what I had to do. I straightened my back and spoke, my voice clear and unwavering. I thank you for your mercy in sparing my life, and I thank those who spoke in my defense. But I cannot renounce my faith. The old gods have not abandoned us, even if many have abandoned them. I will accept exile, with the hope that one day there will be room in this village for many beliefs to coexist in peace. A collective gasp went through the crowd. I saw disappointment on some faces, respect on others. Father Matthias nodded slightly, a look of understanding in his eyes. Erikr's face was grim as he pronounced the final judgment. So be it. Bjorn Thorson, you are hereby exiled from this village. You have until sunset to gather any possessions and leave. May God have mercy on your soul. As the crowd began to disperse, I was led away to prepare for my exile. My heart was heavy, knowing I would have to leave without seeing my family. But I also felt a strange sense of peace. I had stayed true to my beliefs, and in doing so, perhaps I had planted a seed of tolerance that might one day grow. As I walked away from the village that had been my home for so long, I turned for one last look. In that moment, I silently vowed that this would not be the end. Somehow, someday, I would find a way to bridge the gap between the old ways and the new, to create a future where all beliefs could coexist in harmony. With that thought giving me strength, I took my first steps into exile, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the village square. I stood before the assembled crowd, my heart pounding in my chest. The faces before me were a sea of emotion, anticipation, anger, pity, and hope, all swirled together. Erikr, our chieftain, stepped forward. His voice, strong and clear, rang out across the hushed gathering. Bjorn Thorson, you have been offered a choice. Renounce your pagan ways and accept Christ, or face exile from the only home you've ever known. What say you? As I opened my mouth to speak, a flood of memories washed over me. I saw myself as a boy, sitting at my father's knee as he told tales of Thor's mighty battles. I remembered my wedding day, Asta's eyes shining as we jumped the broom in the old tradition. The birth of my children, the naming ceremonies, the countless blots and festivals that had marked the rhythm of my life. All of it passed before my mind's eye in a heartbeat. I took a deep breath and began to recite the words of renunciation that had been prepared for me. I, Bjorn Thorson, hereby renounce the false gods of my forefathers. I reject Odin, Thor, Freya, and all the Aesir and Vanir. I turn my back on the old ways and embrace. But the words caught in my throat. I couldn't continue. The silence in the square was deafening as everyone waited for me to go on. In that moment of hesitation, a sudden clarity washed over me. I realized that this wasn't truly a choice between my gods and my home, between the old ways and the new. There had to be another path. I straightened my back and spoke again, my voice steady and clear. I cannot speak those words, for they would be a lie. The gods of my ancestors are as real to me as the ground beneath my feet, but neither can I continue to resist the changes that have come to our people. A murmur ran through the crowd. I saw Father Matthias lean forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. Good people of this village, my friends and neighbors, I continued, I offer a compromise. I will cease all active resistance to the new faith. I will not speak against Christianity, nor will I attempt to draw others back to the old ways. In return, I ask only that I be allowed to maintain my beliefs in private, harming no one and interfering with no one's worship. The crowd buzzed with whispered conversations. I saw looks of surprise, confusion, and thoughtful consideration on many faces. I pressed on, feeling as though the words were coming not just from me, but from some deeper well of wisdom. Is there not room in our village for different beliefs, held in mutual respect? Can we not honor the gods of our ancestors while also respecting the God of our future? I believe we can find a way to live together in peace, each following the path that speaks to their heart. Eric, my old friend who had spoken in my defense earlier, stepped forward. Bjorn speaks wisely. Have we not all, at one time or another, felt the presence of the old gods? Can we truly say that accepting the Christian God means rejecting everything that came before? Perhaps there is wisdom in both the old ways and the new. His words seemed to resonate with many in the crowd. I saw nods of agreement and thoughtful expressions, but not everyone was swayed. Helga, the former wise woman, spoke up, her voice sharp with disapproval. This is madness. We cannot allow pagan beliefs to persist even in private. It will only lead to more discord, more division among us. And what of Christian charity? Father Matthias interjected, surprising many. Did our Lord not teach us to love our neighbors, to show compassion and understanding? Bjorn offers a peaceful solution. Should we not at least consider it? The debate raged on, voices rising and falling as arguments were made on both sides. I stood silently, watching as my fate was discussed and debated by those around me. Finally, Eriker raised his hands for silence. The square grew quiet, all eyes turning to our chieftain. This is not a decision to be made lightly, Eriker said, his voice grave. Bjorn Thorson has been a respected member of this community for many years. His proposal is unusual, to say the least. But these are unusual times. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on me. Bjorn, you offer to cease active resistance to our new faith. But what of passive resistance? Will you attend Christian services? Will you allow your children to be baptized? I took a deep breath before answering. I will attend services out of respect for our community, though I may not participate in all rituals. As for my children, they are old enough to make their own choices in matters of faith. I will not force them one way or the other. Eriker nodded slowly, then turned to Father Matthias. And you, Father? What does your faith say about such an arrangement? Father Matthias stepped forward, his face thoughtful. Our Lord teaches us to spread his word through love and example, not through force. If Bjorn is willing to live peacefully among us, to respect our beliefs even as he holds to his own, then perhaps this is an opportunity to show the true strength of our faith. The crowd fell silent, waiting for Eriker's decision. The weight of the moment was palpable, and I found myself holding my breath. After what seemed like an eternity, Eriker spoke. Bjorn Thorson, your proposal is unprecedented. It goes against much of what we have been taught about the need to fully embrace our new faith. And yet, he paused, looking out over the assembled villagers. And yet it offers a path of peace in a time when we have seen too much conflict. It speaks to the values of tolerance and understanding that we claim to uphold. My heart raced as I waited for his final judgment. Therefore, Erica continued. I am inclined to accept your compromise, with conditions. You will be allowed to maintain your private beliefs, but you must swear an oath to never again publicly practice or promote the old ways. You will attend Christian services regularly, and you will not interfere with the religious education of the young. Do you agree to these terms? I nodded solemnly. I do. Erica turned to the crowd. If any here have strong objections to this decision, let them speak now. There were murmurs and a few grumbles, but no one stepped forward to object outright. After a moment, Erica nodded. Then it is decided. Bjorn Thorsson, you may remain in our village under these conditions. May this be the beginning of a new era of peace and understanding among us all. As the crowd began to disperse, I felt a complex mix of emotions wash over me. Relief at being allowed to stay, sadness at the compromises I had made, hope for the future, and uncertainty about how this new arrangement would work in practice. Father Matthias approached me, a small smile on his face. You have chosen a difficult path, Bjorn, but perhaps it is one that will lead us all to a greater understanding. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. I hope so, Father, for all our sakes. As I made my way home, my mind raced with thoughts of the future. I had found a way to stay true to my beliefs while also finding a place in this new world. It would not be easy, but as I looked up at the sky, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The old gods were still there, watching over me. The village square fell silent as Erica, our chieftain, raised his hand. All eyes were fixed on him, waiting for his decision. I stood there, my heart pounding, aware that my entire future hung on his next words. Erica's voice rang out, clear and strong. After careful consideration, and in the interest of unity in these challenging times, I have decided to accept Bjorn Thorsson's proposal. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw looks of shock, relief, and in some cases disapproval. We have seen too much division, Erica continued. If we are to thrive as a community, we must find a way to move forward together. Bjorn's compromise, while unconventional, offers us a path to do just that. As the crowd began to disperse, some muttering in discontent while others nodded in approval, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Father Matthias, a small smile on his face. You have been given a rare opportunity, Bjorn, he said softly. Use it wisely. I nodded, still somewhat in shock. I will, Father. Thank you for your support. As I made my way through the village, heading towards my home, I was stopped by several people. Some offered words of support, others warnings to tread carefully, but all I could think about was seeing my family again. As I approached our house, I saw Asta standing in the doorway, Leif and Frida behind her. For a moment, we all stood frozen, staring at each other across the short distance that felt like an unbridgeable chasm. Then Frida broke the spell, running towards me with a cry of, "Father!" I knelt down, catching her in my arms, holding her tight as tears sprang to my eyes. Leif approached more cautiously, but I could see the relief in his eyes. We feared you might be exiled," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I stood, keeping one arm around Frida as I placed my other hand on Leif's shoulder. "I'm here, son. I'm not going anywhere." Finally, I looked at Asta. Her face was a mixture of emotions, joy, apprehension, relief, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Asta," I said softly, "I'm home." She stepped forward, her eyes searching my face. "For how long, Bjorn? Will you be able to abide by the conditions set by Erica?" I nodded solemnly. "I will. I found a way to honor our old gods while respecting the new faith. It won't be easy, but for you, for our family, I'll find a way to make it work." Asta's face softened, and she stepped into my embrace. As I held my family close, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. In the days that followed, I set about establishing a small private shrine on our property. It was a simple affair, a small clearing in the woods behind our house with a rough-hewn altar and carved figures of the gods. When Eriker came to inspect it, accompanied by Father Matthias, I could see the conflict on his face. "This is acceptable," Eriker said finally. "But remember, Bjorn, no public rituals, no proselytizing. This must remain private." I nodded. "You have my word, chieftain. This is for my family and myself alone." Father Matthias stepped forward, his eyes on the shrine. "It's quite beautiful in its way," he said softly. Then turning to me, he added, "Remember, Bjorn, your presence at our services is part of the agreement." "I'll be there, Father," I assured him. "I may not participate fully, but I will attend and show respect for your traditions." As they left, I caught a glimpse of Asta watching from the house, her expression unreadable. The years passed, bringing both challenges and unexpected joys. True to my word, I attended the Christian services regularly. At first, it was uncomfortable. I could feel the eyes of the congregation on me, some curious, some disapproving. But over time, a kind of acceptance grew. I found myself engaged in fascinating discussions with Father Matthias about the nature of faith and the similarities between our beliefs. These conversations often drew others in, and soon, our home became a place where people of both faiths could gather and talk openly. Leif embraced Christianity wholeheartedly, and while it pained me to see him turn from the old ways, I respected his choice. Frida, on the other hand, showed a keen interest in the stories and traditions I kept alive. She would often join me at the shrine, asking questions about the gods and the old rituals. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Asta turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You've become something of a bridge, my love," she said. "People come to you to learn about the old ways, but also to understand how to reconcile them with the new." I nodded, realizing the truth in her words. Without intending to, I had become a keeper of old lore, respected by both pagans and Christians for my knowledge and my willingness to find common ground. As I grew older, I found myself spending more time at my shrine, feeling closer to the gods of my youth. But I also found a deep appreciation for the teachings of Christ, seeing the wisdom in his words of love and forgiveness. On a crisp autumn morning, as I felt the approach of my final days, I called my family to my bedside. Leif came with his wife and children, all wearing crosses. Frida arrived with her husband, who wore both a cross and a Thor's hammer. Asta sat beside me, holding my hand, her face etched with years of love and shared experiences. As I looked at my interfaith family, I felt a profound sense of peace. "I've lived to see something I never thought possible," I said, my voice weak but filled with joy. Our old ways and the new, existing side by side in harmony. Leif leaned forward, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You showed us the way, Father. You taught us that faith is about more than rituals or names. It's about how we treat each other." Frida nodded, adding, "And you kept our heritage alive, even as we embraced new beliefs. We haven't lost our past, we've built on it." As my vision began to fade, I saw something that filled me with awe. There, at the foot of my bed, stood two figures, Odin, one-eyed and wise, and beside him, Christ, radiating love and compassion. They stood together, not as rivals, but as companions on the great journey of faith. In that moment, I understood a truth that transcended all dogma. That faith, in its purest form, is about connecting with something greater than ourselves, about finding meaning and purpose in our brief time on this earth. With my last breath, I whispered, "Thank you to all the gods and to the one God for this life, for this family, for this understanding." As I slipped away, I heard the mingled prayers of my family, some to Odin, some to Christ, but all filled with love. And I knew that in my small way, I had helped to forge a new path, one where the wisdom of the past and the promise of the future could coexist in harmony. In the years that followed, the story of Bjorn Thorson, the pagan who found a way to bridge two faiths, became legend in our village. And though times would continue to change, The spirit of tolerance and understanding that had taken root continued to grow, a living testament to the power of open hearts and open minds.